Hello friends, welcome, settle in, make yourselves comfortable. Today, we're embarking on a journey, a slightly unusual journey into the heart of the Middle Ages. We're going to be exploring a hidden aspect of medieval life, the use of psychoactive substances. Now, I know what you might be thinking, knights, castles, crusades, right? That's the Hollywood version, the one carefully curated over centuries. But the reality, as always, is far more nuanced, far more interesting. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before we delve into the herbs, the brews, and the practices, it's important to clear the air, to dispel some of the common myths that surround this topic. One of the biggest misconceptions is that medieval people were somehow ignorant about the world around them, that they lacked the knowledge to understand, let alone utilize, the power of plants. This couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, they possessed a deep, intimate understanding of their natural environment, born out of necessity and passed down through generations. Think about it. They didn't have pharmacies on every corner, no readily available doctors for every ailment. They relied on the wisdom of their elders, on the traditions of herbalism to heal their wounds, soothe their pains, and yes, even to alter their perceptions. Their lives were intimately tied to the seasons, to the cycles of growth and decay. They observed, they experimented, and they learned. And a vital part of that learning involved understanding the properties of the plants that grew around them, both the beneficial and the potentially dangerous. Another common misconception is that using psychoactive substances in the Middle Ages was some sort of widespread, chaotic free-for-all, a constant state of intoxication. Again, not quite right. While alcohol was indeed a staple, and we'll get to that, we will get to that, the use of other mind-altering substances was often more deliberate, more controlled. It wasn't about escaping reality all the time, but rather about interacting with it in different ways, for specific purposes. Think of it more as a tool, employed for healing, for spiritual insight, for social bonding, or simply for dealing with the harsh realities of medieval life. And let's be clear, those realities were harsh. Life expectancy was shorter, disease was rampant, and physical labor was the norm. So it's perhaps not surprising that people sought ways to alleviate their suffering, both physical and mental. And sometimes those ways involved substances that we would today classify as psychoactive. Now, it's also important to remember that the line between medicine and recreation was often blurred, if it existed at all. What we might consider a drug today, they might have considered a medicine, a sacrament, or simply a part of everyday life. The context was everything. A plant used in a healing potion could also be used in a ritual, or even in a simple social gathering, and the intention behind its use would dramatically alter its perceived effect. Think about the power of suggestion, the placebo effect. If someone believed that a particular herb would cure their illness or grant them visions, that belief could significantly enhance the experience, making it more profound, more meaningful. The mind, after all, is a powerful thing. Of course, there were also dangers. Just as today, there were risks associated with using these substances. Overdoses, adverse reactions, and adulteration were all very real possibilities. Medieval people weren't ignorant of these dangers, and they developed their own ways of mitigating them through careful preparation, dosage control, and yes, even through trial and error. But mistakes were made, and lives were sometimes lost. It's a sobering reminder that even the most ancient traditions can have unforeseen consequences. So what are we talking about, exactly, when we talk about psychoactive substances in the Middle Ages? Well, we're not just talking about getting drunk on ale, though that was certainly a common pastime. We're talking about the use of plants like opium poppy, with its pain-relieving and euphoric properties. We're talking about henbane, a powerful and potentially dangerous plant used in medicine and witchcraft. We're talking about mandrake, a legendary root believed to possess magical powers and potent hallucinogenic effects. We're even talking about ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and can cause mass hallucinations and other rather unpleasant symptoms. These are just a few examples, of course. The world of medieval psychoactive substances was vast and varied, encompassing a wide range of plants, herbs, and fungi, each with its own unique properties and effects, and each region of Europe had its own local traditions, its own preferred substances, its own ways of using them. So as we journey through this fascinating, often overlooked aspect of medieval life, let's keep an open mind, a healthy dose of skepticism, and a willingness to challenge our own preconceptions. Let's remember that the past is not a simple black and white story, but a complex tapestry woven from countless threads, some of which are hidden from view. And by exploring those hidden threads, by shedding light on the darker corners of history, we can gain a deeper, richer understanding of ourselves and the world around us. Now, are you ready to delve into this strange, intoxicating world? Good, let's begin. Alright, settle in, friends. Let's talk about the glue that held medieval society together a little bit, shall we? No, not feudalism, not religion, although both played a big part. I'm talking about alcohol. It wasn't just a pastime, it was a cornerstone of daily life. Imagine trying to get through a long, cold winter without something to warm you from the inside out. It would be pretty rough. You see, unlike our modern world, with its readily available clean water, in the medieval period, drinking water was often, well, less than ideal. Think about it. Open wells, rivers used for everything from washing clothes to disposing of other things. Not exactly a refreshing beverage. Brewing, on the other hand, involved boiling water, which killed off a good chunk of the nasty bugs that could make you seriously ill. So from a purely practical standpoint, alcoholic beverages were often safer to consume than water. This made them not a luxury, but a necessity for everyone, even children, though they were given much weaker brews. Now let's dive into the specifics. When we talk about medieval drinks, three contenders really stand out: ale, mead, and wine. Let's start with ale. Ale was the undisputed champion of the common folk. It was the everyday drink, the equivalent of our modern-day coffee or tea, but, with extra benefits. Made primarily from malted barley, ale was relatively easy to produce, making it accessible to most households. Think of it as a sort of homemade bread, but liquid. The process was simple, or at least simple-ish. Sprout the barley to convert the starches into sugars, dry it, mash it with hot water, ferment it with yeast, and Bob's your uncle, you've got ale. Now, uncle may not be your uncle, as names changed back then, but the process would still result in ale. The strength of the ale varied wildly. What we would consider today small beer or table beer was extremely common, with a very low alcohol content, sometimes even less than 1%. This was the drink of choice for children and laborers alike, providing a bit of hydration and a few extra calories without the, shall we say, debilitating effects of stronger brews. Then there was the good stuff, the ale that would actually give you a buzz. This was reserved for special occasions, celebrations, or simply a hard day's work, needing a suitable reward. Brewing was typically a domestic affair, carried out by women in the household. It was a skill passed down through generations, and a good brewwife was highly valued in the community. Excess ale could even be sold, providing a small source of income for the family. So brewing was far more than just making a drink. It was an integral part of the household economy and social fabric. Next up, we have mead, often referred to as honey wine, and as the name suggests, mead is made from fermented honey. This gave it a sweeter, richer flavor than ale. Making mead was generally more expensive and time-consuming than brewing ale, simply because honey was a more precious commodity than barley. This meant that mead was often associated with the upper classes, nobles, and even monastic orders who had the resources to maintain beehives. Mead was often reserved for special occasions, feasts, and religious ceremonies. It was considered a drink fit for kings and gods, and was frequently mentioned in mythology and folklore. Think of it as the champagne of the medieval world, though maybe a bit less bubbly. Variations abounded. Some meads were spiced with herbs and fruits, adding complexity and flavor. Others were mixed with ale or wine to create unique blends. Lastly, we come to wine. While ale was the drink of the masses, and mead held a place of honor, wine was the drink of the elite. The best wines, of course, came from regions with suitable climates for grape cultivation, primarily southern Europe, France, Italy, Spain. However, even in regions with less ideal climates, monasteries and wealthy landowners often cultivated vineyards, producing their own, albeit sometimes less palatable, versions of wine. The production of wine was a more complex and labor-intensive process than brewing ale or mead. It required specialized knowledge, equipment, and of course grapes. This made it a more expensive drink, primarily enjoyed by the nobility, clergy, and wealthy merchants. Wine was seen as a symbol of status and refinement. It was served at banquets, used in religious rituals, and even prescribed as medicine. Different types of wines were available, from light and fruity to rich and full-bodied, depending on the grape variety and the wine-making techniques used. But let's be real, even if you were a peasant quaffing ale all day, the constant, low-level consumption of alcohol likely had a noticeable effect. It wasn't about getting roaring drunk all the time. It was about a gentle, sustained buzz, a softening of the edges of a harsh reality. It's hard to say exactly how it impacted cognitive function, but we can assume that it played a role in shaping their perception of the world. Imagine a world where almost everyone is mildly inebriated, at least part of the time. It's a rather different picture from our own, isn't it? And there's one more piece to the puzzle, the social aspect. Taverns and alehouses were central to medieval community life. They were places to gather, socialize, exchange news, conduct business, and of course drink. Think of them as the Facebook of the Middle Ages, but with better drinks and less cat videos. They were often rowdy and boisterous places, full of laughter, singing, and the occasional brawl. But they were also vital social hubs, connecting people from all walks of life. So it was definitely about so much more than just quenching one's thirst. It was about community and connection. Alright, settle in, because we're about to delve into the fascinating world of medieval brewing. Forget everything you think you know about beer. We're not talking about crisp, golden lagers. We're talking about Groot. Now, what exactly is Groot? Well, before hops became the dominant ingredient in beer, brewers used a blend of herbs called Groot to flavor and preserve their ales. Think of it as the spice rack of the medieval brewery. Instead of relying on the bittering and preservative qualities of hops, they crafted complex brews using a wide variety of locally available plants. The exact composition of Groot varied from region to region, and even from brewer to brewer, but some common ingredients included sweet gale, also known as bog myrtle, yarrow, and heather. These weren't just added for flavor though. Each herb contributed something unique to the final product, from bitterness and aroma to potential medicinal and yes, even psychoactive effects. Let's take a closer look at some of these key ingredients and their potential, let's just say, special properties. First up, sweet gale. This plant, with its aromatic leaves, was a common substitute for hops. It imparted a pleasant, slightly spicy bitterness to the ale, but it also contained compounds like marcene. Now, marcene is a terpene, and terpenes are aromatic compounds found in many plants, including cannabis. While sweet gale doesn't contain nearly as much marcene as cannabis, it's worth noting that marcene is known to have relaxing and sedative effects, so that medieval ale might have been a little more calming than your average pint today. Next we have yarrow. Yarrow was another popular Groot ingredient, known for its bitter taste and antiseptic properties. It helped to preserve the ale and prevent spoilage. But yarrow also contains thujone, a compound that's also found in absinthe. Thujone is a GABA receptor antagonist, which means it can have stimulating and in high doses even hallucinogenic effects. While the levels of thujone in yarrow are generally quite low, it's possible that some medieval brewers used yarrow varieties with higher concentrations or simply used more of it, potentially adding a subtle psychoactive element to their brews. Then there's heather. Heather was often used to add a floral aroma and a slightly sweet flavor to Groot ales. But heather also contains arbutin, which can be converted into hydroquinone in the body. Hydroquinone has mild antiseptic and diuretic properties, but it can also cause mild euphoria in some people. It's also worth mentioning that heather honey, made by bees that feed on heather flowers, was sometimes added to these ales, further enhancing the sweetness and potentially adding to the overall effect. Now, beyond these common ingredients, medieval brewers experimented with a whole host of other herbs, many of which have known psychoactive properties. Think mugwort, which was used for its purported dream-enhancing qualities, or rosemary, which was believed to improve memory and focus. Even juniper berries, which are now commonly used in gin, were sometimes added to Groot ales, lending their distinctive flavor and potentially contributing to a mild sense of relaxation. But here's where things get really interesting. Records suggest that some brewers even used ingredients like henbane in their Groot ales. Henbane, as we'll discuss in more detail later, is a highly poisonous plant with potent hallucinogenic properties. While it's unlikely that henbane was a common ingredient in everyday ale, for obvious reasons, its occasional use suggests that some brewers were deliberately experimenting with psychoactive substances. We can imagine, in hushed tones and shadowed corners, certain recipes being shared and experimented with that had stronger and stronger effects. It's important to remember that medieval brewers didn't have the same scientific understanding of these plants as we do today. They relied on traditional knowledge and experimentation to determine the effects of different herbs. They observed how people reacted to their brews, and they adjusted their recipes accordingly. This trial and error approach undoubtedly led to some interesting and unpredictable results. Furthermore, the strength and potency of these Groot ales would have varied depending on a number of factors, including the specific herbs used, the brewing techniques employed, and even the growing conditions of the plants themselves. A batch brewed with freshly harvested, potent herbs might have been significantly more psychoactive than a batch brewed with older, less potent ingredients. Now, you might be wondering, if these Groot ales were so potentially mind-altering, why didn't everyone just get high all the time? Well, a few factors would have limited the psychoactive effects. First, the concentrations of psychoactive compounds in these herbs were generally quite low. You would have needed to consume a significant amount of ale to experience any noticeable effects. Secondly, the alcohol content of medieval ales was often relatively low, so you'd likely be feeling the effects of the alcohol before you felt anything else. And thirdly, the other ingredients in the ale, such as grains and spices, would have masked the taste and potentially counteracted some of the psychoactive effects. Still, it's fascinating to consider the possibility that medieval people were subtly altering their states of consciousness on a regular basis, simply by drinking their everyday ale. Imagine the possibilities: subtle shifts in perception, enhanced creativity, or simply a heightened sense of relaxation and well-being. Perhaps these Groot ales played a role in shaping medieval culture and society in ways that we're only beginning to understand. The switch to hops was gradual. Hops offered more consistent bittering and preservative qualities, making it easier to produce ale on a larger scale. As hop cultivation spread, Groot slowly fell out of favor, eventually becoming a forgotten chapter in the history of brewing. But the legacy of Groot lives on. In recent years, there's been a resurgence of interest in these ancient brewing techniques, with some craft brewers experimenting with Groot recipes and rediscovering the unique flavors and potential effects of these forgotten herbs. So the next time you're enjoying a craft beer, take a moment to appreciate the long and fascinating history of brewing, and to imagine the complex and potentially psychoactive ales that were once enjoyed by our medieval ancestors. It's a fascinating thought, isn't it? Alright, let's gently drift into the world of the opium poppy. Papaver somniferum. Sounds almost like a lullaby, doesn't it? This plant, a seemingly delicate flower, held a significant place in the lives of medieval people. Forget the modern connotations and images that might immediately spring to mind. We're talking about a different context, a world where pain relief was scarce and readily available, mood alteration even scarcer. The opium poppy wasn't a clandestine substance skulking in the shadows, at least, not initially. Its cultivation was widespread, even encouraged in some areas. Imagine sprawling fields dotted with these vibrant blossoms. Their colors a welcome contrast to the often monochromatic landscape. Unlike today, growing opium poppies wasn't inherently illegal. Think of it more like growing wheat or barley, a crop with multiple uses, one of which just happened to involve altered states of consciousness. Now let's talk about how they actually got that altered state. The process wasn't as simple as popping a pill. It required knowledge, patience, and a fair amount of labor. The key ingredient, of course, was the raw opium, harvested from the unripe seed pods. A few days after the petals fall, the pod, a sort of bulb, would be carefully scored, usually in the late afternoon or evening. A sharp knife, or even a specialized tool, was used to make shallow cuts into the pod's surface, allowing a milky white latex to seep out. This latex, exposed to the air overnight, would oxidize and thicken, transforming into a brownish, gummy substance, raw opium. The next morning, this hardened opium would be scraped off the pods. This was a labor-intensive process, requiring skilled hands to avoid damaging the pods and maximizing the yield. The collected opium could then be processed further. One common method was to form it into small cakes or balls, which could be stored and transported.
But what did they do with it? How did they use it? Well, there were a few primary methods. Smoking opium, the image that might pop into your head, wasn't really the norm in medieval Europe. Instead, it was far more common to ingest it. Small amounts of raw opium could be dissolved in wine, ale, or even water, creating a potent elixir used for pain relief, sleep induction, and of course mood alteration. Think about the challenges of medieval life. Chronic pain from injuries, arthritis, or just the sheer physical demands of daily labor was incredibly common. Opium offered a respite, a temporary escape from the constant aches and pains. Imagine a weary farmer, after a long day in the fields, sipping a small cup of opium-laced ale. The relief must have been profound. It also played a role in medical practices. Medieval physicians, lacking the advanced understanding and pharmaceuticals we have today, relied heavily on herbal remedies and natural substances. Opium was a valued tool in their arsenal, used to treat a wide range of ailments, from coughs and diarrhea to insomnia and anxiety. It was even used as an anesthetic during surgical procedures, although, let's be honest, surgery in the Middle Ages was a far cry from the sterile and pain-free experience we expect today. Now, let's gently consider social acceptance. Opium wasn't viewed with the same stigma it carries today. It was more like a strong medicine, something to be used with caution perhaps, but not necessarily condemned outright. Its acceptance varied depending on social class and geographical location. In some areas it was a common household remedy, freely available and used by people of all walks of life. In others, it may have been more restricted, perhaps primarily used by the wealthy or by medical practitioners. Of course, even in the Middle Ages, people weren't completely ignorant of the potential dangers of opium. Overdoses, although perhaps not fully understood in the way we understand them today, were certainly recognized. There are accounts of people becoming incapacitated or even dying from consuming too much opium. Addiction, too, was likely a problem, even if it wasn't labeled as such. People would undoubtedly develop a dependence on its pain-relieving and mood-altering effects. However, the overall attitude toward opium was far more nuanced than a simple condemnation. It was a complex substance, seen as both a blessing and a potential curse. A powerful tool that could alleviate suffering but also lead to harm if misused. Its widespread use also suggests a certain level of cultural acceptance or at least tolerance. While the Church in some instances may have frowned upon excessive indulgence in anything that altered the mind, opium use, particularly for medicinal purposes, seems to have been largely tolerated. Think about the context. Life was harsh. Suffering was commonplace. Opium offered a temporary escape, a moment of relief in a world filled with hardship. In that light, its acceptance, or at least its prevalence, becomes a little easier to understand. It wasn't necessarily about seeking pleasure or escaping reality entirely, although that may have been a factor for some. It was often about simply coping with the pain and suffering of everyday life. And in that sense, the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, played a significant, albeit often overlooked, role in the lives of medieval people. A role that deserves a more nuanced and understanding perspective than perhaps we typically apply today. So as the poppy fields gently sway in our minds, let's drift onwards. Let's delve into a plant that played a surprisingly significant role in medieval life. Henbane, or Hyoscyamus niger. Just the name itself sounds a little ominous, doesn't it? Henbane. It's a plant with a long and complex history, deeply intertwined with both medicine and perhaps more famously, witchcraft. Now, before we conjure up images of bubbling cauldrons, let's ground ourselves in the basics. Henbane is a member of the nightshade family, a family known for its potent members. Think tomatoes, potatoes, but also deadly nightshade and belladonna. Henbane, with its unassuming, almost drab appearance of greyish-green leaves and sticky hairs, might not seem immediately threatening. But trust me, appearances can be deceiving. The plant thrives in waste places, along roadsides, and in disturbed ground. It's fairly common across Europe and Asia, so it would have been readily available to medieval populations. This accessibility, coupled with its potent psychoactive properties, contributed to its widespread use, and sometimes misuse. In medieval medicine, henbane was primarily valued for its analgesic and sedative qualities. Imagine a time before aspirin, ibuprofen, or modern anesthetics. Chronic pain, surgical procedures, even just a bad toothache. These were all realities of medieval life, and effective pain relief was desperately sought after. Henbane, with its active compounds like hyoscyamin and scopolamine, offered a means to alleviate suffering. Physicians would have used it cautiously, of course. They understood that henbane was a powerful substance, and that the line between therapeutic dose and toxic dose was incredibly fine. It wasn't a risk-free remedy by any means. Think of it like this: a medieval doctor using henbane was walking a tightrope. They were trying to provide relief to their patient, but they were also very aware that one wrong step could lead to serious, even fatal consequences. Recipes for medicinal preparations involving henbane survive in numerous medieval medical texts. These texts often detail specific methods for processing the plant. Some suggest boiling the leaves in wine or milk to extract the active compounds. Others recommend using henbane seeds, carefully measured and administered. The goal was to create a concoction that was potent enough to provide pain relief or sedation, but not so strong that it would poison the patient. Henbane was employed to treat a range of ailments. It could be used as a topical ointment for ulcers, gout, and other inflammatory conditions. It was also taken internally to relieve intestinal cramps, asthma, and even whooping cough. In surgical procedures, henbane could be administered to induce a state of semi-consciousness, allowing surgeons to perform operations with less resistance from the patient. Again, it's a far cry from modern anesthesia, but it was a tool that doctors utilized to make some of the harsher realities of medieval life a little more bearable. However, it's the association of henbane with witchcraft that often captures the imagination. In folklore and popular belief, henbane was a key ingredient in flying ointments, those infamous concoctions that witches were said to use to achieve altered states of consciousness and, well, to fly. Now, let's be clear. No one actually flew in the literal sense, but the hallucinogenic properties of henbane, when combined with other psychoactive herbs and applied topically, could certainly induce a sensation of lightness, dissociation, and even the vivid illusion of soaring through the air. The way these ointments worked is quite interesting. They were typically made by combining henbane with other plants like belladonna, mandrake and aconite, all of which contain tropane alkaloids. These alkaloids are readily absorbed through the skin, particularly in areas where the skin is thin, such as the armpits or groin. Once absorbed, they can produce a range of effects from hallucinations and delirium to a feeling of weightlessness and euphoria. Imagine applying such an ointment and then lying down in a darkened room. The world around you would begin to shift and distort. Colors might become more vibrant, sounds might become amplified, and your sense of self might begin to dissolve. You might experience visions of fantastical landscapes, encounter spirit guides, or feel as though you were floating above the earth. It's not hard to see how these experiences could have been interpreted as evidence of witchcraft or supernatural powers. The use of henbane in witchcraft wasn't simply about achieving altered states, though. It was also deeply connected to pagan beliefs and practices. In many pre-Christian traditions, plants were seen as possessing spirits or energies, and their use was often accompanied by rituals and incantations. Henbane, with its potent effects, was considered to be a particularly powerful plant, capable of opening pathways to the spirit world. Furthermore, it's worth remembering the position of women in medieval society. Often excluded from traditional medical practices and learning, women found themselves as the custodians of herbal knowledge. In many cases, these women were the village healers, the ones people turned to when doctors were too expensive or unavailable. The knowledge of plants like henbane became central to their practice, and of course that knowledge made them vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. The association between henbane and witchcraft undoubtedly contributed to the plant's demonization. The church actively suppressed pagan beliefs and practices, and anyone who was suspected of using herbs for magical purposes risked being accused of heresy. The consequences could be dire, ranging from public shaming to imprisonment, torture, and even death. So henbane occupies a curious and complex place in medieval history. It was a valuable medicine, a tool for pain relief and sedation, but it was also a plant shrouded in mystery and fear, associated with witchcraft and the darker aspects of the medieval imagination. It's a reminder that even seemingly innocuous plants can hold tremendous power, both for good and for ill. And it highlights the importance of understanding the historical context in which these plants were used and perceived. Because you see, the story of henbane is not just the story of a plant, it's a story of medicine, of magic, of power, and of fear, all intertwined in the rich tapestry of the medieval world. Mandrake. Even the name conjures images of ancient rituals and whispered secrets. Mandragora officinarum. A plant steeped in folklore, riddled with potent alkaloids, and feared as much as it was revered. Let's gently peel back the layers of mystique surrounding this root, and see what we can uncover about its role in the medieval mindset. First off, a quick botanical note. Mandrake is a perennial plant, part of the nightshade family, a family known for its, shall we say, interesting chemical compositions. It's native to the Mediterranean region, and while it prefers warm climates, it could be cultivated, though that cultivation carried its own risks, which we'll get to in a moment. But it's the root that truly sets mandrake apart. It's often forked, vaguely resembling the shape of a human body, and it's this anthropomorphic quality that fueled much of the plant's legend and magical properties. Now about that folklore. The most famous, and arguably the most terrifying, belief surrounding mandrake was its scream. It was said that when the root was pulled from the earth, it would emit a piercing shriek that could drive anyone who heard it insane, or even kill them outright. Imagine trying to harvest a remedy, and instead inviting madness. This belief made harvesting mandrake an incredibly dangerous task, one only attempted with extreme caution and elaborate rituals. So how did medieval folks actually harvest this screaming root? Well, accounts vary, but a common method involved using a dog. The harvester would tie the mandrake root to the dog's tail, then tempt the dog with food just out of reach. As the dog lunged for the food, it would pull the root from the ground, effectively sacrificing the dog to the mandrake's scream. Cruel, yes, but it highlights the level of fear and respect this plant commanded. Other accounts speak of drawing circles around the plant with a sword, facing west, and plugging one's ears with wax or clay to mute the sound. Some even suggested harvesting at midnight, under the light of the moon, chanting specific incantations. It was serious business, this mandrake harvesting. Beyond the scream, mandrake was attributed with a whole host of magical powers. It was believed to bring good fortune, protect against evil spirits, and even grant fertility. Small mandrake root amulets were carried for protection, placed under pillows to induce prophetic dreams, and used in love potions to, let's just say, encourage affection. It was a plant deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life, a potent symbol of both danger and hope. But we're not just interested in the lore, are we? What about the hallucinogenic properties? Well, here's where things get interesting, and also a little bit dangerous. Mandrake contains a cocktail of tropane alkaloids, primarily hyoscyamine, scopolamine, and atropine. Sound familiar? You might recognize those names from our discussion on henbane. These substances are powerful anticholinergics, meaning they block the action of acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter crucial for nerve function. In small doses, these alkaloids can have some medicinal effects. Mandrake was used as a pain reliever, a sedative, and even as an anesthetic for minor surgeries. Imagine trying to pull a tooth without modern painkillers. Mandrake would have been a welcome, albeit risky, option. It was also used to treat ulcers, coughs, and even melancholy. Medical texts from the period detail various preparations, often involving soaking the root in wine or milk. But here's the thing, the line between a therapeutic dose and a toxic dose is razor thin, and the effects of these alkaloids are unpredictable, to say the least. At higher doses, mandrake can induce vivid hallucinations, delirium, confusion, and even coma. The visions were often described as incredibly realistic and immersive, blurring the line between reality and dream. Users might experience strange sensations, distorted perceptions of time and space, and intense feelings of euphoria or terror.
These hallucinogenic properties likely contributed to mandrake's association with witchcraft and magic. Imagine someone consuming mandrake and experiencing intense hallucinations and altered states of consciousness. To those unfamiliar with the plant's effects, it would appear as if the person were possessed or under the influence of some supernatural force. It's easy to see how mandrake became a key ingredient in witches' flying potions and rituals designed to contact the spirit world. Now, I need to emphasize the extreme danger of experimenting with mandrake. The alkaloid content can vary significantly depending on the plant, the growing conditions, and the preparation method. An attempt to recreate a medieval recipe could easily lead to serious health consequences, even death. This is not a plant to be trifled with. Our journey is strictly academic, exploring the historical context and understanding the medieval perspective, not advocating for any sort of experimentation. Furthermore, the psychological effects can be incredibly disturbing. The delirium and confusion associated with mandrake poisoning can be terrifying, leading to paranoia, anxiety, and long-lasting psychological trauma. It's a far cry from a pleasant psychedelic experience, so please, leave this plant to the history books and the realms of folklore. Appreciate it from a safe distance. So to recap, mandrake was more than just a plant in the medieval world. It was a symbol, a legend, a medicine, and a potential poison. It was feared for its scream, revered for its magic, and used, often recklessly, for its potent effects. Its story offers us a fascinating glimpse into the complex relationship medieval people had with the natural world, and the lengths they would go to in search of healing, knowledge, and perhaps a glimpse beyond the veil of reality. And now, let's move on to another plant with a similarly complex and often dangerous past. Ergot. Even the name sounds a bit ominous, doesn't it? Ergot, or Claviceps purpura, is a fungus, a particularly nasty one that infects rye and other cereal crops. Now, in our modern world of fungicides and advanced agricultural practices, we don't often have to worry about ergot poisoning. But back in the medieval period, well, it was a real significant threat. Imagine entire harvests, the lifeblood of communities, tainted with this hidden danger. What made ergot so insidious wasn't just its presence, but its effects. You see, ergot contains a variety of alkaloids, powerful chemical compounds, and one of the most infamous of these is ergotamine. Ergotamine is, chemically speaking, a precursor to lysergic acid, the very foundation upon which LSD is built. Now, I'm not saying medieval peasants were dropping acid like it was going out of style, but the potential for hallucinogenic effects was definitely there, lurking within those contaminated grains. Ergot poisoning, known historically as St. Anthony's fire, a rather poetic though terrifying name, manifested in two primary forms. The first, and perhaps most gruesome, was gangrenous ergotism. The alkaloids in ergot constricted blood vessels, particularly in the extremities. Imagine the feeling of your hands and feet slowly going numb, then cold, then turning black and necrotic. Eventually, the affected limbs could literally fall off. It was a slow, agonizing death, often accompanied by fever and delirium, a truly horrifying prospect. The second form was convulsive ergotism. This one was even more, let's say, interesting from a historical perspective. Convulsive ergotism involved violent muscle spasms, seizures, and yes, hallucinations. People afflicted with this form of the poisoning would writhe in agony, experience vivid and often terrifying visions, and exhibit bizarre behaviors. Some accounts describe people believing they were possessed by demons or transformed into animals. Picture that playing out in a small, tightly knit medieval village, fueled by superstition and religious fervor. It's easy to see how these episodes could have been interpreted as divine punishment, witchcraft, or demonic possession. Now, let's take a step back and think about the social context. Rye was a staple crop, particularly for the poorer populations in northern Europe. If the rye harvest was bad, or if it was heavily contaminated with ergot, these communities had very few alternatives. They were essentially forced to consume the contaminated grain, often without realizing the danger. Ergotism outbreaks, therefore, tended to be localized and seasonal, often coinciding with periods of famine or poor harvests. Can you imagine the fear and desperation that would grip a village facing starvation, knowing that their only source of food could also be their doom? So how did they know, or did they know, about the dangers of ergot? Well, knowledge was likely a mixed bag. Some people, particularly those with experience in herbalism or traditional medicine, may have recognized the signs of ergot poisoning. They might have associated it with moldy or discolored grain, or with particular symptoms like the burning sensation in the limbs that gave rise to the name St. Anthony's fire. However, without a scientific understanding of the underlying cause, it was difficult to prevent outbreaks or effectively treat the afflicted. And here's where things get really interesting. Given the hallucinogenic properties of ergot alkaloids, it's tempting to speculate about the role of ergot in medieval religious experiences, witchcraft, and even mass hysteria. Could some of the accounts of religious visions, demonic encounters, or out-of-body experiences have been, at least in part, attributable to ergot poisoning? It's a controversial idea, and certainly not one that can be definitively proven, but it's a fascinating possibility to consider. Think about it. If a community was already predisposed to believe in the supernatural and then experienced a sudden outbreak of ergotism, the resulting hallucinations and bizarre behaviors could easily be interpreted through the lens of their existing beliefs. Visions of saints could be seen as divine interventions, while terrifying hallucinations could be attributed to demonic influence. The afflicted individuals might even be seen as witches or possessed, leading to further persecution and social upheaval. The Salem witch trials, for instance, have been the subject of much debate and speculation. While there are many factors that likely contributed to the hysteria, some researchers have suggested that ergot poisoning could have played a role in the strange behaviors and accusations that characterized the trials. It's a compelling, though unprovable, theory. Of course, it's important to avoid oversimplifying things. Ergot was certainly not the only cause of hallucinations or unusual behaviors in the medieval period. Mental illness, other psychoactive substances, and simple imagination all played a role. But ergot does offer a tantalizing glimpse into the complex interplay between biology, culture, and belief in the medieval world. In summary, ergot was a real and terrifying threat to medieval populations. It caused excruciating pain, death, and potentially contributed to altered states of consciousness that shaped religious beliefs, witchcraft accusations, and social dynamics. It's a potent reminder that the world around us, even the seemingly benign grains we eat, can harbor hidden dangers and unexpected effects, and it paints a rather grim, yet utterly fascinating, picture of life in the Middle Ages. Now, while opium, henbane, mandrake, and ergot might steal the spotlight when discussing medieval psychoactive substances, it's vital to remember that the medieval landscape was a veritable pharmacy of other potentially mind-altering plants. And just like any skilled apothecary, the people of the time knew how to work with their local ingredients. Let's turn our attention now to a few other key players in this story: belladonna, datura, and the array of other regional flora that undoubtedly contributed to altered states of consciousness. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, is perhaps one of the more infamous examples. Even its name, deriving from the Italian belladonna, meaning beautiful woman, hints at its darker lore. Women used extracts of belladonna to dilate their pupils, creating a wide-eyed, captivating gaze. Now, this might seem like a relatively harmless cosmetic practice, but the active compounds in belladonna, primarily atropine and scopolamine, are potent anticholinergics. This means they disrupt the normal functioning of the nervous system, leading to a range of effects, from blurred vision and dry mouth to delirium, hallucinations, and even paralysis. The line between beauty enhancement and accidental poisoning was therefore incredibly thin. It's likely that many women experienced unintended psychoactive effects from belladonna use, ranging from mild disorientation to full-blown hallucinatory episodes. Imagine the experience: a flickering candle, already casting strange shadows on the walls, now amplified by the blurred vision and swirling thoughts induced by the belladonna. The mundane becomes extraordinary, the familiar transforms into something alien and unsettling.
And the effects weren't limited to cosmetic applications. Belladonna was also used medicinally, albeit cautiously.
Skilled herbalists would employ it in small doses to treat conditions like asthma, muscle spasms, and even menstrual cramps. However, the dosage was critical, and miscalculations could have devastating consequences. We have to remember that quality control was non-existent. Potency varied wildly, depending on the plant's growing conditions, the time of harvest, and the preparation methods. A dose that might provide relief one day could easily prove toxic the next. Then we have Datura, a close relative of belladonna and equally endowed with potent anticholinergic properties. Like belladonna, Datura contains atropine and scopolamine, making it a powerful deliriant. Different species of Datura grow across the world, and it is most definitely present in the medieval European archaeological record. Its effects are so intensely disorienting and unpleasant that it's often referred to as devil's weed. While belladonna might have held a certain dark romanticism, Datura was generally regarded with fear and trepidation. Its use was likely less widespread, but its impact, when it did occur, would have been unforgettable. The hallucinations induced by Datura are often described as intensely realistic and terrifying. Users might experience vivid encounters with deceased relatives, monstrous creatures, or even feel as though they are being tortured. The line between reality and hallucination blurs to the point of non-existence, leaving the individual trapped in a nightmarish landscape of their own mind. It's difficult to imagine the context in which someone in the Middle Ages might willingly ingest Datura. Perhaps it was used in extreme rituals as a form of ordeal, or maybe accidentally ingested as a contaminant in other plant preparations. One possibility lies in the realm of witchcraft accusations. Imagine someone perhaps already suffering from mental illness or sleep deprivation, inadvertently consuming Datura. Their subsequent erratic behavior, bizarre pronouncements, and vivid hallucinations could easily be interpreted as evidence of demonic possession or witchcraft, leading to dire consequences. Beyond these two potent examples, countless other local plants likely played a role in altering consciousness during the medieval period. Consider the various species of mushrooms that grow wild throughout Europe. While some are edible and nutritious, others contain psychoactive compounds like psilocybin and psilocin, the same compounds found in magic mushrooms today. It's highly improbable that medieval people were completely ignorant of the effects of these mushrooms. Some might have been consumed accidentally, leading to unexpected and perhaps frightening experiences. Others might have been used intentionally in shamanic rituals or healing practices. The knowledge of which mushrooms were safe and which were dangerous would have been passed down through generations, a mixture of practical experience and folklore. Then there are the plants with milder, but still noticeable, psychoactive properties. Certain herbs like mugwort were used in brewing and smoking mixtures believed to enhance dreams and promote relaxation. Others like vervain were associated with magical practices and believed to possess the power to influence the mind and spirit. Even common plants like chamomile, while primarily valued for their calming properties, might have contributed to the overall tapestry of altered states in medieval life. A peasant laborer, exhausted after a long day in the fields, might sip a cup of chamomile tea to soothe their nerves and ease them into sleep. The cumulative effect of these small, seemingly insignificant choices could have subtly shaped their perception of the world. It's also important to remember the role of synergistic effects. The combination of different plants, each with its own unique properties, could have produced unexpected and amplified results. A brewer, experimenting with different herbs and spices in their ale, might inadvertently stumble upon a concoction that induced particularly potent or unusual effects. The medieval world was a world steeped in herbal knowledge, a world where the line between medicine, magic, and everyday life was often blurred. And as we delve deeper into this world, it becomes increasingly clear that psychoactive plants were not just occasional curiosities, but integral components of the medieval experience, subtly shaping the thoughts, feelings, and beliefs of the people who lived in it. Their experiences of highs, lows, visions, and delusions are now lost to us, but the plants themselves remain as silent witnesses. Alright, settling in now, let's delve into what the medieval texts themselves can tell us about the use of psychoactive substances. This is where things get really interesting, because we're not just relying on guesswork or modern interpretations. We're going to look directly at the words of the people who lived during that time. Think of it like this: we're historians, yes, but we're also detectives, sifting through clues left behind in dusty manuscripts. And those clues are hidden within the pages of herbals, those essential guides to plants and their properties, medical treatises which describe how physicians treated ailments, and of course folklore, those stories and beliefs passed down through generations. Herbals are a great place to start. These weren't just pretty picture books. They were practical guides for apothecaries, physicians, and even ordinary people who wanted to understand the natural world around them. Now, the key thing to remember is that medieval herbals often described plants in terms that we might not immediately recognize today. They might not explicitly say, "This plant will make you hallucinate." Instead, they'd use phrases like, "It causes strange visions," or "It induces a heavy sleep with fantastical dreams." Take, for instance, descriptions of henbane, Hyoscyamus niger. We touched on this one earlier. It's often described as having the power to trouble the mind or cause delirium. These aren't exactly ringing endorsements, are they? But from our perspective, knowing what we do about the plant's chemical composition, these descriptions are pretty clear indicators of its psychoactive effects. Herbals may also mention the plant's use in magical rituals or spells, hinting at a purpose beyond simple medicinal application. Another important aspect of herbals is how they classify plants according to humours. Medieval medicine was heavily influenced by the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each plant was believed to possess qualities that could either balance or unbalance these humours. So a plant that was considered hot and dry, for example, might be used to counteract a condition caused by an excess of cold and wet phlegm. This system offers a unique lens for understanding how medieval people perceived the effects of different plants, including those with psychoactive properties. Now let's turn our attention to medical treatises. These are fascinating because they offer insights into how physicians used plants to treat various ailments. We're talking everything from headaches and insomnia to melancholy and even more serious conditions. Opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, is a prime example. Medical texts often detail its use as a pain reliever, a sleep aid, and even a cough suppressant. But they also often mention the potential for addiction and overdose, showing that physicians were aware of the dangers associated with its use. Similarly, mandrake, Mandragora officinarum, is frequently mentioned in medical texts, but with a healthy dose of caution. It was recognized as a powerful anesthetic, sometimes used to induce unconsciousness before surgery. However, it was also known to cause delirium, hallucinations, and even death if used improperly. The recipes are, frankly, terrifying. Medieval doctors clearly understood its potent effects, and their writings reflect both its potential benefits and its inherent risks. Folklore, of course, adds another layer to the puzzle. This is where we find stories, beliefs, and traditions that have been passed down orally for generations. Folklore can be tricky to interpret because it's often intertwined with myth and legend, but it can also provide valuable clues about how people actually used and perceived psychoactive plants. For instance, many folk tales feature witches using various herbs and potions to cast spells or communicate with spirits. While these stories may be fictional, they often reflect real-world practices and beliefs about the power of plants. The association of certain plants with witchcraft, like belladonna or henbane, suggests that they were indeed used for purposes beyond just medicine. Folklore can also offer insights into the cultural significance of altered states of consciousness. Stories of visions, dreams, and encounters with supernatural beings may reflect the use of psychoactive substances to induce altered states for religious or spiritual purposes. Remember, the line between the natural and the supernatural was often blurred in the medieval mind, and psychoactive plants may have been seen as a way to bridge that gap. One particularly interesting area of folklore is the belief in plant spirits. Many cultures throughout history have believed that plants possess a spirit or essence that can be communicated with or influenced. This belief may have played a role in how people used psychoactive plants, viewing them as a way to connect with the spirit world or gain access to hidden knowledge. But, and this is important, we need to be careful not to romanticize or oversimplify the medieval use of psychoactive substances. These weren't just recreational drugs, although they may have been used in that way sometimes. They were often deeply intertwined with medicine, religion, and magic, and their use was often guided by complex cultural beliefs and practices. By carefully analyzing herbals, medical treatises, and folklore, we can begin to piece together a more nuanced understanding of how medieval people interacted with psychoactive plants and the role that these substances played in their lives. It's like assembling a jigsaw puzzle, one piece at a time, and with each new piece, the picture becomes a little clearer, a little more vibrant, a little more, well, medieval. It's a fascinating journey into the past, isn't it? Alright, settle in everyone, because in this section we're diving headfirst into the really fascinating stuff, the tangible stuff, archaeological findings. We're talking about evidence that whispers secrets from the soil, telling tales of medieval minds seeking something beyond the ordinary. We're not just relying on dusty old books and ambiguous mentions anymore. Here, we're getting our hands dirty, so to speak. Now, you might be thinking, medieval archaeology, drugs? How would that even work? And it's a fair question. It's not like we're unearthing medieval stash houses overflowing with, well, anything illegal. The reality is far more subtle, far more detective-like. It's about piecing together tiny fragments of evidence to build a convincing picture. The two main areas where archaeology really shines a light on this are residue analysis and burial practices. Let's start with residue analysis. Imagine tiny microscopic traces of a substance clinging to the inside of a ceramic pot, absorbed into the fibers of a textile, or even trapped within the dental calculus. That's the hardened plaque on a human skull. These seemingly insignificant remnants can be analyzed using sophisticated scientific techniques like gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, a bit of a mouthful, I know, and other methods to identify the specific compounds present. Essentially, scientists can break down these residues into their component parts and match them against known profiles of psychoactive plants. Think of it like forensic science, but for history. For example, a study looking at residues in pottery shards from a medieval monastery might find traces of opium alkaloids. That's a big clue. It suggests that the monks, known for their herbal knowledge and medical practices, were cultivating and using opium poppies. It's not definitive proof that they were all getting high as kites, of course, but it strongly hints at the presence and use of the substance. Similarly, residue analysis can help us identify the ingredients of medieval beers and ales. Remember how we talked about Groot ales and the use of herbs before hops became the standard? Well, analysis of residues from brewing vessels can reveal the presence of plants like henbane or even smaller amounts of other potential psychoactive ingredients. It's really like opening a window into their brewing process and potentially finding some rather interesting secrets. Now, it's crucial to remember that residue analysis isn't always straightforward. Contamination can be a huge issue. The soil itself can contain all sorts of organic compounds that might mimic or mask the presence of targeted substances. And of course, the absence of residue doesn't necessarily mean the plant wasn't used. The pot might have been cleaned meticulously, or the substance might have degraded over time. It's all about interpreting the evidence cautiously and considering all the possibilities. But when combined with other historical sources, residue analysis can be incredibly powerful. It can confirm suspicions raised by written accounts, illuminate practices that were deliberately hidden, and provide a level of detail that simply isn't available anywhere else. Okay, so that's residue residue analysis. Let's move on to burial practices. How can burial practices tell us about drug use? Well, this is where things get a little more interpretive, but still fascinating. Think about it. Burial rituals often reflect a society's beliefs about the afterlife, about healing, and about the transition from the earthly realm to, well, wherever they believed they were going. Sometimes individuals were buried with objects that were believed to have medicinal or ritual significance. For instance, if someone is buried with a pouch containing henbane seeds, or with a pipe that shows residue suggesting psychoactive use, it might suggest that they held a special role in society. Perhaps they were healers, shamans, or individuals who regularly used these substances for religious or spiritual purposes. Another clue can come from the positioning of the body or the presence of certain grave goods. Were they buried in a way that suggests they were given special status? Were they buried with objects that are unusual for their social class? These are all potential indicators that the individual might have been involved in practices related to altered states of consciousness. Of course, interpreting burial practices requires a great deal of caution. It's easy to jump to conclusions based on limited evidence, but by carefully considering the context of the burial, the associated artifacts, and the overall archaeological record, we can sometimes gain insights into the role that psychoactive substances played in medieval beliefs and rituals. One example that I find particularly intriguing involves the discovery of skeletons showing signs of chronic pain or debilitating illness, buried with what appear to be opium poppies, or near areas where opium poppies were likely grown. This would strongly suggest use as a pain reliever. While we have the written records to support this, finding the physical evidence gives us an understanding that simply can't be gained anywhere else. Think about that for a moment. Imagine that final act of kindness and care, as someone slipped something more into the deceased's hand to ease them on their final journey. Gives you chills, right? Ultimately, the archaeological evidence for drug use in medieval times is fragmentary and complex, but it's also incredibly revealing. By combining residue analysis with careful examination of burial practices, we can start to piece together a more complete picture of how medieval people interacted with psychoactive substances, why they used them, and what role these substances played in their lives. It's a slow, painstaking process, but every new discovery brings us closer to understanding the medieval mind and the human desire to explore the boundaries of consciousness. And honestly, isn't that what makes history so fascinating? So, we've seen how various psychoactive substances were used, sometimes quite casually, throughout medieval Europe. But what did the church, that ever-present authority, think about all this? Well, as you might imagine, the relationship was complicated. On the one hand, the church held immense power, both spiritual and temporal. It dictated societal norms, influenced laws, and possessed a vast network of knowledge and resources. So any widespread use of substances that altered consciousness was bound to attract its attention. The core issue for the church was control over the individual, control over narratives, and ultimately, control over the path to salvation. Anything that bypassed or challenged that control was viewed with suspicion, and often outright hostility. Think about it. The church positioned itself as the sole intermediary between humanity and God. It offered the sacraments, preached the scriptures, and guided believers towards righteousness. Altered states of consciousness, induced by plants or other means, could be seen as a shortcut, a way to experience something profound without the church's guidance. And that, well, that simply wouldn't do. It could undermine the very foundation of their authority. Now, it's important to remember that the medieval church wasn't a monolithic entity. Different orders, different regions and different eras saw varying degrees of tolerance and condemnation. Some monastic orders, for instance, maintained extensive herb gardens, cultivating plants for medicinal purposes. And, as we know, many medicinal plants have psychoactive properties. Monks and nuns, often secluded from the outside world, may have explored these properties in their own ways, perhaps in the pursuit of spiritual insight or simply to alleviate suffering. We also have to consider the role of alcohol. Wine, of course, was central to the Christian sacrament of communion, representing the blood of Christ. So alcohol wasn't inherently evil. In fact, it was often seen as a gift from God, providing sustenance and comfort. But, as with all things, moderation was key. Drunkenness, especially excessive drunkenness, was condemned as a sin, a loss of control that could lead to immoral behavior and spiritual degradation. Think of the depictions of gluttony and sloth in medieval art, often featuring slurring, inebriated figures. These images served as stark warnings against the dangers of overindulgence. However, the Church's concern went beyond simple drunkenness. Practices rooted in pre-Christian traditions, often involving psychoactive plants, were viewed with deep suspicion, even as demonic. Remember those herbs we talked about, like henbane and mandrake? These were associated with witchcraft, pagan rituals, and all sorts of unsavory activities. The Church actively sought to suppress these practices, often demonizing the plants themselves and associating them with the devil. This fear of the other, the unexplained, and the uncontrolled played a significant role in the persecution of witches. While not all accused witches used psychoactive substances, the association was strong. The confessions extracted during witch trials often involved details of flying ointments, brewed potions, and other mind-altering concoctions. These confessions, whether based on reality or induced by torture and suggestion, further fueled the Church's paranoia and led to increasingly brutal crackdowns. It's also worth noting that the Church's efforts to control altered states of consciousness weren't always direct or overt. Sometimes it was more subtle, a matter of shaping perceptions and promoting alternative narratives. For example, the Church emphasized the importance of prayer, meditation, and other spiritual practices as a means of achieving divine revelation. These practices offered a safe and approved way to access altered states of awareness, channeling religious fervor into socially acceptable outlets. Think of the ecstatic visions described by medieval mystics, visions that were often interpreted and validated by Church authorities. These visions, while potentially similar to those induced by psychoactive substances, were framed within a Christian context, reinforcing the Church's authority and control. Furthermore, the Church actively promoted the veneration of relics and saints. These objects and individuals were believed to possess divine power, capable of healing the sick, granting miracles, and offering spiritual guidance. Pilgrimages to sacred sites became a popular form of religious devotion, providing an opportunity for individuals to experience something extraordinary, something beyond the ordinary realm of everyday life. These experiences, while not necessarily involving psychoactive substances, could nonetheless induce altered states of consciousness, a sense of connection to something greater than oneself. And crucially, they were all sanctioned by the Church. So the Church's relationship with altered states of consciousness in medieval times was a complex dance of control, suppression, and co-option. It sought to maintain its authority by condemning practices that challenged its power, demonizing substances associated with witchcraft, and promoting alternative, Church-approved pathways to spiritual experience. It was a struggle for the minds and souls of the people, a struggle that played out against a backdrop of widespread substance use, deeply ingrained folk traditions, and profound religious beliefs. It is truly a fascinating push and pull of influence, tradition, and power, and it left its mark on pretty much everything we've talked about. And now, friends, let's gently wander into a space where the line between reality and something more becomes beautifully blurred. We're talking about visions and mysticism. In the medieval world, these weren't separate concepts, neatly filed away. They were intertwined, informing each other, shaping beliefs and experiences in profound ways. Imagine, if you will, someone living in the 12th century. Their world is deeply fundamentally religious. God is everywhere, constantly present, intervening in daily life. Miracles are expected, demons are feared, and the path to salvation is a paramount concern. For many, that path involved seeking a direct personal connection with the divine. And how might they achieve this? Through prayer, of course, through fasting, penance, and pilgrimage, but also, perhaps, through the very substances we've been discussing. Consider the ergot-tainted rye, for instance. Imagine the village gripped by a strange affliction, St. Anthony's fire, as they called it. But amidst the burning limbs and agonizing pain, might there also be visions, hallucinations so vivid, so powerful, that they were interpreted as divine messages? It's certainly possible. Ergot alkaloids, the compounds within the fungus, are structurally similar to LSD. Now, we can't say for certain that medieval villagers were dropping acid, but the potential for profound alterations in consciousness was undeniably there. And in a world already steeped in religious symbolism, those alterations could easily be interpreted through a spiritual lens. Think about it. A peasant, already deeply devout, consuming bread made from tainted rye. He begins to see angels, to hear the voices of saints, to experience feelings of intense euphoria or terrifying dread. In the absence of scientific understanding, what other explanation could there be but divine intervention, or perhaps demonic possession? But it wasn't just accidental ingestion. The use of psychoactive plants like henbane and mandrake, particularly by those on the fringes of society, opens up another fascinating avenue. These plants, we know, were sometimes used in rituals, in attempts to contact spirits, to gain knowledge or power. Now, it's easy to dismiss these practices as mere superstition or outright delusion, but consider the mindset of the individuals involved. They believed, truly believed, that these plants held power, that they could open doors to other realms, and that belief, coupled with the actual pharmacological effects of the plants, could create a potent cocktail of sensory distortion and spiritual experience. Imagine a wise woman, or perhaps a cunning man, brewing a potion containing henbane. As they drink it, their senses begin to shift. The world around them warps and distorts. They may experience vivid hallucinations, feeling as though they are flying or communicating with otherworldly entities. For them, this isn't just a drug-induced trip. It's a genuine spiritual experience. It's a validation of their beliefs, a confirmation of the power they wield. It's a connection, however fleeting, to the divine or the demonic, depending on their worldview. And the church? How did the church respond to these experiences? Well, it was complicated. On one hand, the church was often deeply suspicious of anything that bypassed its authority. Direct, unmediated experiences of the divine were potentially dangerous, as they could lead to heresy or challenge the church's control. The church, after all, wanted to be the sole interpreter of God's will, the gatekeeper to salvation. Uncontrolled visions and mystical experiences were a threat to that control. Hence, the persecution of those deemed heretics, witches, or simply mad. However, the church also recognized the power of visions and mystical experiences. Many saints, after all, had claimed to have received divine revelations. Saint Hildegard of Bingen, for example, was a 12th century Benedictine abbess who experienced profound visions throughout her life. These visions, which she carefully documented, were seen as a source of divine wisdom and authority. So the church had to tread carefully. It couldn't simply dismiss all visions as demonic trickery. It had to discern between genuine divine experiences and those that were deemed false or dangerous. This often led to intense scrutiny, interrogation, and even trials. The key, it seemed, was orthodoxy. If the visions aligned with church doctrine, they were more likely to be accepted. If they contradicted it, they were considered heretical and potentially dangerous. And what about those substances that might induce these visions? The church generally frowned upon the deliberate use of psychoactive plants for spiritual purposes. It viewed such practices as superstitious, pagan, and potentially demonic. However, the use of certain plants for medicinal purposes, even if they had psychoactive side effects, was often tolerated, particularly if prescribed by a physician. Ultimately, the relationship between hallucinations, mysticism, and religion in the medieval world was a complex and nuanced one. It was shaped by beliefs, fears, power dynamics, and the very real effects of the substances that people consume. It reminds us that our perceptions of reality are not fixed or absolute. They are shaped by our culture, our beliefs, and our experiences. And sometimes, just sometimes, they are shaped by the plants and fungi that grow around us, offering a glimpse into worlds beyond our everyday understanding. A glimpse that in the medieval mind could be nothing less than a direct encounter with the divine. The medieval world, as we've discussed, was no stranger to altered states, but sometimes the line between healing and heresy, between traditional knowledge and forbidden practice, became dangerously blurred. And this is where we find ourselves at the crossroads of witchcraft and herbalism. For centuries, women, and occasionally men, possessed a wealth of knowledge about the natural world, particularly the medicinal properties of plants. They were the healers, the midwives, the keepers of ancient lore, passing down recipes and remedies from one generation to the next. Their gardens weren't just for show, they were living pharmacies filled with herbs to soothe aches, ease childbirth, and even, yes, induce altered states of consciousness. Think of it as a vast unwritten pharmacopoeia, passed down through generations, meticulously observed and refined. Now, consider the context: a world steeped in religious dogma, where the church held immense power and viewed anything outside its control with suspicion. Knowledge, especially knowledge held by women, was often seen as a threat. The church was the gatekeeper of truth, the interpreter of divine will, and here were these individuals, often operating outside of the established medical system, wielding power through their understanding of the earth. The line between herbalist and witch, therefore, was incredibly thin and easily crossed. Imagine a peasant woman, skilled in using henbane to ease pain or belladonna to dilate pupils for cosmetic reasons. To her, it was simply a useful plant, a tool for alleviating suffering or enhancing beauty. But to a fearful and superstitious community, fueled by the church's rhetoric, she could easily be accused of witchcraft, of consorting with dark forces, of using her knowledge to cast spells and inflict harm. And let's be clear, some of these plants could inflict harm, even unintentionally. Dosage was critical, and the difference between a therapeutic dose and a toxic one was often a matter of experience and intuition. A slight miscalculation could lead to delirium, paralysis, or even death. This inherent risk further fueled the fear surrounding these plants and those who used them. Furthermore, the accusations weren't always about actual harm. Sometimes it was simply about power, control, or even jealousy. A woman who was too independent, too knowledgeable, or too assertive could easily become a target. All it took was a whisper, a suspicion to brand her as a witch and unleash the full force of the Inquisition. The concept of the witch's brew is a fascinating example of this intersection. We often picture bubbling cauldrons filled with bizarre and grotesque ingredients, concocted for nefarious purposes. And while some of these depictions are certainly exaggerated, there's a kernel of truth in them. Many witches' brews likely contained psychoactive plants like henbane, mandrake, and belladonna. These weren't necessarily intended to cause harm, but rather to induce altered states for ritualistic purposes, for divination, or even simply for pain relief. But the very act of mixing these plants, of engaging in practices outside of the church's control, was enough to condemn someone as a witch. The persecution of witches, of course, varied across Europe. Some regions were more tolerant than others, while others were gripped by intense witch hunts. But the underlying fear and suspicion remained constant, fueled by religious fervor and societal anxieties. The Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, a notorious handbook for witch hunters, solidified the association between women, herbalism, and demonic forces. It provided detailed instructions on how to identify, interrogate, and punish suspected witches, further legitimizing the persecution of those who possessed traditional knowledge. It's important to remember that not everyone accused of witchcraft was an innocent victim. Some individuals may have genuinely believed they possessed magical powers, while others may have used their knowledge of plants for malicious purposes. But the vast majority were likely simply women who possessed valuable skills and knowledge that were misunderstood and feared by the authorities. The suppression of herbal knowledge had profound consequences. It not only led to the persecution and death of countless individuals, but it also stifled the development of medicine and prevented the preservation of valuable knowledge. The knowledge that was passed down was often done so in secret, leading to a fragmented and distorted understanding of the properties and uses of these plants. So, as we consider the medieval use of psychoactive substances, we must also acknowledge the dark side of this history. The fear and suspicion surrounding herbalism, the persecution of those who possessed traditional knowledge, and the tragic consequences of these events. It's a reminder that knowledge is power, and that power can be easily abused, especially when it's wielded in the name of fear and intolerance. It shows that access to resources, including psychoactive plants and herbal recipes, was directly affected by social standing, gender, and position in the eyes of the church and the ruling class. Alright, let's settle in and consider how these sometimes powerful, sometimes subtle psychoactive substances played a part in the community gatherings of the medieval world. It's easy to imagine them as purely solitary pursuits, a lone witch brewing a potion, or a monk scribbling feverish visions after imbibing something, perhaps not quite sanctioned. But that's really only a slice of the story. Think about it. Medieval life was, for the vast majority, a deeply communal experience. Villages huddled together, fields were worked collectively. Religious festivals were the highlight of the social calendar, binding communities together through shared experiences. And often interwoven into these experiences were practices that involved, either knowingly or unknowingly, altered states of consciousness. Let's start with the obvious. Feasts. Medieval feasts weren't just about stuffing your face, although that was certainly a part of it. They were elaborate affairs, often marking important events like harvests, weddings, or religious holidays. And of course, alcohol flowed freely. Ale, mead, and wine were consumed in vast quantities. We've already talked about how the brewing processes were less refined then, often including various herbs and spices that might have had their own subtle psychoactive effects. But beyond that, simply the sheer volume of alcohol consumed would undoubtedly have led to widespread intoxication. Now, what happens when a whole village is tipsy, or even outright drunk? Inhibitions lowered, laughter becomes louder, stories become more fantastical. Arguments might erupt more easily, but so too might forgiveness and reconciliation. The collective experience of intoxication could act as a social lubricant, easing tensions and reinforcing bonds within the community. Think about the harvest festivals. The reaping and gathering of the crops was celebrated with gusto, a sigh of relief after months of hard labor. Mead would be shared, folk songs sung, and dances performed. These rituals, fueled by alcohol, likely served to release pent-up energy and anxieties, reinforcing the community's resilience and sense of shared identity. Then there are the celebrations surrounding rites of passage. Weddings, for example, were often multi-day affairs involving elaborate rituals and feasts. Alcohol would again play a central role, but other substances might also have been involved, even if their psychoactive properties weren't fully understood. Herbal preparations passed down through generations might have been given to the bride and groom, ostensibly to promote fertility or ensure a happy union. Some of these preparations could have contained herbs with mild sedative or euphoric effects, contributing to the overall celebratory atmosphere. Funerals, too, while somber occasions, sometimes involved practices that could be interpreted as attempts to connect with the deceased or to ease the grief of the bereaved. While alcohol could have numbed the pain, other herbs might have been used in rituals or ceremonies. We know that certain plants were associated with death and the afterlife, and it's not unreasonable to suggest that they might have been used in ways that intentionally altered the state of consciousness, perhaps to facilitate visions or dreams of the departed. Beyond the formal events, consider the everyday community practices. Village gatherings, such as communal baking or spinning, would often involve the sharing of food and drink. Ale, even in small quantities, could have been a regular feature of these gatherings, contributing to a sense of conviviality and shared purpose. And again, the herbs used in these brews could have subtly influenced the mood and atmosphere of the gathering. It's important to remember that the medieval understanding of pharmacology was very different from our own. People might not have fully grasped the specific chemical compounds responsible for the effects they experienced, but they were certainly aware of the effects themselves. They learned through observation, through trial and error, and through the accumulated wisdom of generations. So a wise woman in the village, skilled in herbal remedies, might know that a certain plant could ease pain, or induce sleep, or lift the spirits. She might not know exactly why it worked, but she knew that it worked. And she would have used this knowledge to help her community, offering remedies for ailments, and perhaps even subtly influencing the mood of social gatherings. Now, of course, all of this raises some interesting questions about the role of these substances in shaping medieval culture and society. Did they simply enhance existing social practices, or did they actually shape them in some way? Did they contribute to a sense of collective identity and shared experience, or did they create divisions and tensions within the community? It's difficult to say for sure, but it seems likely that they played a complex and multifaceted role. They were both a product of and a contributing factor to the social fabric of medieval life. They helped people to celebrate, to mourn, to connect with each other, and perhaps even to transcend the limitations of their everyday existence. And while the potential for abuse and harm was certainly present, it's important to remember that these substances were often used within a framework of social norms and traditions that helped to regulate their use and minimize their negative consequences. The community, in a sense, acted as a buffer, providing support and guidance, and ensuring that these powerful substances were used in a way that benefited the collective rather than harming it. So the next time you imagine a medieval feast, don't just picture the overflowing tables and the boisterous revelry. Think also about the subtle ways in which psychoactive substances might have been at work, shaping the mood, influencing the interactions, and ultimately contributing to the creation of a shared experience that bound the community together. It was a different world, a different understanding, but the human desire for connection, for celebration, and perhaps even for a brief escape from the everyday remains timeless. Ah, yes. Now let's gently turn our attention to the vital topic of pain relief in the medieval world. When modern medicine was but a distant dream and the corner drugstore was non-existent, people turned to what nature provided to ease their suffering, and as we've already touched upon, that often included plants with, shall we say, interesting properties. Imagine, if you will, being a medieval surgeon. Now, surgeon might be a generous term, given the limited understanding of anatomy and the ever-present risk of infection. Your patient is about to undergo a rather unpleasant procedure, perhaps an amputation or the setting of a badly broken bone. Now, what's a healer to do? You can't just pop down to the pharmacy for some anesthetic, can you? This is where our herbal allies came into play. Opium, derived from the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, was a common and relatively accepted method of dulling pain. We've talked about it before, and its pervasive presence throughout medieval society cannot be overstated. Preparations of opium, often in the form of laudanum, a tincture of opium in alcohol, were administered to patients before surgery. The goal wasn't necessarily to render them completely unconscious, although that could happen with a high enough dose. More often, it was to make the experience bearable, to dull the sharp edges of agony and allow the surgeon to work with a somewhat calmer, less resistant patient. However, opium wasn't the only option on the medieval pharmacopoeia. Henbane, that dark and fascinating plant we explored earlier, also played a role. While more dangerous and unpredictable than opium, henbane possessed powerful analgesic and sedative properties. It was often used topically in ointments or poultices to numb specific areas of the body before minor procedures, like stitching a wound or lancing a boil. The scopolamine and hyoscyamine within henbane worked to block nerve signals, effectively reducing the sensation of pain. But again, tread carefully. The line between pain relief and delirium was a very thin one with henbane. Too much, and your patient might be seeing things that aren't there, or worse, never wake up. Then there was mandrake. Mandrake, steeped in folklore, whispered about in hushed tones, and possessing some truly remarkable, if somewhat scary, effects. Mandrake root, with its vaguely human shape, was believed to hold powerful magic, and its use as an anesthetic was well documented. Preparations of mandrake were administered orally, or sometimes even applied topically, to induce a state of drowsiness and reduced sensitivity to pain. The alkaloids within mandrake, like scopolamine and hyoscyamine, work in a similar way to henbane, but often with even more pronounced hallucinatory effects. Imagine undergoing surgery in a hazy, dreamlike state, where the boundaries between reality and fantasy blur. Quite the experience, wouldn't you say? But it wasn't all about surgery. These psychoactive plants were also used to manage chronic ailments. Think about arthritis, a common affliction in a time of hard labor and limited medical understanding. Opium, in small doses, could provide some much-needed relief from the constant pain and inflammation. Henbane, again, might be used in ointments to soothe aching joints. Toothaches, even conditions we might now treat with simple over-the-counter medications like headaches or menstrual cramps, were addressed with these potent herbal remedies. Now, it's important to remember that these treatments weren't without their risks. Dosage was a constant concern. There were no precise measurements, no clearly labeled bottles with warnings about side effects. Herbalists and healers relied on their experience and knowledge, but the potency of plants could vary greatly depending on the growing conditions, the time of harvest, and the method of preparation. Accidental overdoses were, unfortunately, not uncommon. Furthermore, the addictive potential of opium was certainly recognized, even if the underlying mechanisms weren't fully understood. Medieval texts often caution against prolonged use of opium, warning of the dangers of dependence and the weakening of the body. And of course, there was the risk of misidentification. Many plants look deceptively similar, and mistaking one for another could have disastrous consequences. Imagine accidentally using belladonna, deadly nightshade, instead of a more benign herb. The results could be fatal. So, while psychoactive plants offered a valuable means of pain relief in medieval times, they were also a double-edged sword. They provided much-needed respite from suffering, but they also carried the risk of addiction, overdose, and accidental poisoning. It was a delicate balancing act, a constant negotiation between the potential benefits and the inherent dangers, and it underscores just how different and how precarious medical care was in those days. They were truly doing their best with what they had, in a world that often felt unforgiving and harsh. Hello there, sleepyheads. Welcome back. Tonight, we're going to gently drift into a perhaps slightly unsettling but important corner of our exploration of psychoactive substances in the medieval world: children. Now, this isn't meant to be a disturbing journey, but rather a realistic glimpse into the lives of those who couldn't always make choices about what they were exposed to. It's easy for us to recoil at the thought of children and psychoactive substances, and rightly so, but let's try to understand the context. Medieval life was harsh, filled with pain and disease, and frankly, desperation often led to choices we simply can't judge by modern standards. Medical knowledge was rudimentary. What we now know about childhood development simply didn't exist. So, let's gently unpack this. One of the most common uses of psychoactive substances for children was in teething remedies. Oh, the dreaded teething. Any parent, then or now, knows the relentless, heart-wrenching cries of a teething infant. Medieval mothers, desperate for relief, often turned to poppy-based preparations. Opium, derived from the opium poppy, was readily available and known for its pain-relieving properties. It was seen as a natural remedy, a gift from the earth. Imagine a mother, exhausted and sleep-deprived, watching her child suffer. She might soak a piece of cloth in poppy seed tea or a weak opium solution and let the baby suck on it. The opium would act as a sedative, easing the pain and calming the child. While it undoubtedly worked in the short term, the long-term consequences were, of course, devastating. We now know the dangers of opiate addiction, even in tiny bodies. But back then, the immediate relief outweighed the unknown risks. We also need to consider the pervasive presence of alcohol. We talked earlier about how ale, mead, and wine were staples of the medieval diet, often safer to drink than water due to contamination. Children, even very young ones, were routinely given diluted ale or wine. This wasn't necessarily intended to get them intoxicated, although it undoubtedly sometimes did. It was more about hydration and providing calories, as these beverages were often enriched with grains and fruits. Think about it. If the water source was suspect, a weak ale might be the only readily available liquid. And while we would never consider giving alcohol to infants today, it was a different world then. The lines between food, medicine, and intoxicant were far more blurred. Beyond teething and hydration, some traditional practices involved the intentional use of psychoactive plants for children in specific rituals or for perceived medicinal benefits. Folklore often attributed special powers to certain herbs, believing they could ward off evil spirits or protect children from illness. For example, a child might be bathed in water infused with henbane or belladonna, not realizing the potent and dangerous chemicals they contain. These plants were sometimes believed to have protective qualities, creating a sort of invisible shield around the child, or perhaps a small amulet containing dried mandrake root was worn, thought to bring good luck and health. It's crucial to understand that these practices weren't necessarily malicious. People genuinely believed they were doing what was best for their children. Their understanding of the world was shaped by superstition, folklore, and limited medical knowledge. They were often working with what they had, trying to navigate a world full of uncertainty and danger. However, the dangers were very real. Accidental poisoning was a constant threat. Children are naturally curious and prone to putting things in their mouths. A brightly colored berry or an interesting-looking root could easily prove fatal if it contained potent psychoactive compounds. Even when given intentionally, the dosage was often imprecise, leading to unpredictable and potentially deadly consequences. A slightly stronger batch of poppy seed tea or a larger dose of henbane in a bath could easily overwhelm a child's delicate system. And because medical knowledge was so limited, recognizing and treating the symptoms of poisoning was often a challenge. The realities of medieval childhood were stark. Infant mortality rates were high. Disease was rampant, malnutrition was common, and children were often exposed to substances that we now know are incredibly dangerous. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? but it's also important to remember the resilience of children. Despite the challenges they faced, many thrived, growing up to lead full and productive lives. And even in the face of ignorance and hardship, parents loved and cared for their children as best they knew how. So as we gently close this section, let's take a moment to appreciate the advances in modern medicine and our understanding of child development. Let's also remember the complexities of the past and avoid judging people by standards that simply didn't exist in their time. Perhaps this slightly more somber note can gently ease you off into a deeper sleep as we consider the vulnerability of children throughout time. Soft, gentle music swells slightly and then fades again to background. The noble's life. We've spent some time looking at the quite ordinary, often difficult, lives of the medieval folk, but let's now peek behind the curtain and see how things differed for those born into privilege. And when it came to exploring the edges of perception, well, their access to certain substances was decidedly elevated. Think about it. Trade routes, controlled by powerful merchants and protected by noble armies, brought not just silks and spices, but also exotic plants and more refined, shall we say, preparations from distant lands. These weren't just novelties for the wealthy, they opened doors to experiences that were largely unavailable to the average peasant. Let's start with spices. We often think of them simply as flavor enhancers, but many spices possess properties that go beyond mere taste. Saffron, for example, not only added a vibrant yellow hue to food, but it was also believed to have mood-enhancing qualities. Think of it as a very mild, very expensive medieval antidepressant. Cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon. These were all prized possessions, not just for their flavor in mulled wine and festive dishes, but also for their perceived medicinal and, dare I say, psychoactive properties. Now, we aren't talking full-blown hallucinations here, but the subtle lift in mood, the easing of anxieties, these were definitely benefits enjoyed by those who could afford them. Beyond spices, the nobles had access to exotic plants that were simply unheard of in the average village. Consider the trade in opium. While poppy cultivation was known in Europe, the finest opium, prepared with the utmost care, often came from the East. It wasn't just for medicine, though it was certainly used for pain relief. It could also be used recreationally, in controlled doses, to induce a sense of euphoria and relaxation. Imagine a lord, weary from managing his estates and engaging in political intrigue, retreating to his private chambers for a pipe of opium, a practice far removed from the concerns of his serfs. Then there were the brews. While the common folk largely relied on ale, often thin and weak, nobles enjoyed access to stronger wines and meticulously crafted meads. Wine, especially from regions like France and Italy, was a status symbol in itself. But the truly discerning noble would seek out wines that had been enhanced, perhaps infused with herbs like rosemary or wormwood, not just for flavor, but for their subtle psychoactive effects. And mead, that honeyed wine, could be made with various herbs and spices, creating unique and potent concoctions. We're talking about beverages that went far beyond simple intoxication. Furthermore, the wealth of the nobility allowed them to employ skilled apothecaries and physicians. These individuals possessed knowledge of plant properties that was often shrouded in secrecy. They could prepare remedies and potions tailored to the specific desires of their patrons. Need a sleeping draught to ensure a restful night, or perhaps a tonic to sharpen the mind and enhance focus. The noble had access to expert knowledge and preparation that the average person could only dream of. The gardens of noble estates also played a role. These weren't just places for growing food, they were often repositories of medicinal and exotic plants. Herbs like belladonna and mandrake, known for their potent effects, might be cultivated in secluded corners, their uses known only to a select few. The noble's gardener, often a figure of respect and knowledge, could be a key player in accessing these hidden resources. And let's not forget the element of experimentation. With access to resources and a certain degree of freedom from societal constraints, nobles were more likely to indulge in trying new things. A visiting merchant might bring tales of a plant used by shamans in a faraway land, and a curious noble might be tempted to acquire it and explore its effects. This isn't to say that they were all reckless hedonists, but they certainly had the means to explore the boundaries of experience in ways that were simply not possible for the vast majority of the population. Now, a word of caution. Just because nobles had access to these things doesn't mean they were all engaging in wild, drug-fueled orgies. That's a trope, a stereotype. The reality was likely far more nuanced. Some nobles might have been deeply religious and abstained from such practices altogether. Others might have used these substances sparingly for medicinal or spiritual purposes. And of course, there would have been those who indulged more freely, perhaps to excess. Just like any social group, there was a wide spectrum of behavior. But the key takeaway here is access. The noble's life offered a level of comfort, security, and access to resources that fundamentally changed their relationship with psychoactive substances. They weren't just limited to what grew in the local fields, they could reach out to the wider world and sample its offerings. And in doing so, they potentially experienced a range of altered states that were largely unknown to those lower down the social ladder. It's a fascinating glimpse into a world where privilege extended even to the realm of consciousness. All right, settle in, friends. Let's imagine for a moment that we're no longer in the brightly lit present. Let's travel back to a time when most of Europe was blanketed in fields, forests, and a general air of, shall we say, organic living. We're talking about the life of a medieval peasant, and well, let's just say their days weren't exactly filled with Netflix and chill. But that doesn't mean they were strangers to altered states of consciousness. Far from it. Now, a common misconception is that peasants were just toiling away, completely oblivious to the finer or perhaps blurrier things in life. But the truth is, they had their own unique ways of, shall we say, tuning in to a different frequency. It wasn't about raiding the local dispensary, because, well, there weren't any. It was about what was readily available, the plants that grew in their fields, the herbs in their gardens, and the simple brews they concocted in their homes. Think about it. Life was hard, really, really hard. Backbreaking labor from sunup to sundown, unpredictable weather, rampant disease, and the constant threat of, well, everything. A little bit of, escape was probably pretty welcome. One of the most ubiquitous sources of altered states was, unsurprisingly, alcohol. But forget your fancy craft beers and carefully aged wines. For the peasant, it was all about ale, often a thin, weak brew, but potent enough when consumed in sufficient quantities. And believe me, they consumed it. Ale was safer than water, which was often contaminated. It provided calories, and of course it provided a nice gentle buzz, taking the edge off a long day of ploughing or harvesting. Now, this wasn't just any ale. Before hops became the standard ingredient, brewers used something called gruit. Gruit was a mixture of herbs, often including things like yarrow, bog myrtle, and heather. And some of these herbs had psychoactive properties. Yarrow, for example, was believed to have mild sedative effects. Bog myrtle, well, that added a certain aroma, shall we say. The exact recipes varied from region to region, and even from household to household, meaning that every batch of ale was a unique experiment in home brewing and herbal alchemy. So picture this, a peasant coming home after a long day in the fields. They sit down to a simple meal of bread and maybe some cheese or vegetables, and they wash it down with a generous helping of gruit ale. The alcohol starts to kick in, the herbs begin to work their magic, and suddenly the aches and pains of the day start to fade away. The world seems a little bit brighter, a little bit softer. It wasn't about getting completely wasted, it was about finding a moment of respite, a little bit of solace in a harsh world. But it wasn't just alcohol. Peasants also used a variety of local herbs for medicinal and recreational purposes. Remember, they didn't have access to modern pharmacies. Their medicine cabinet was the surrounding countryside, and some of those plants had effects that went beyond just treating aches and pains. Take, for example, the humble poppy. While opium production on a large scale wasn't as prevalent as it would later become, poppies did grow in many parts of Europe, and peasants knew how to use them. The seeds were used in baking, adding a nutty flavor and a mild sedative effect. The sap could be extracted and used for pain relief. It was a risky business, of course, as too much could be dangerous, but in small doses, it could provide much needed relief from chronic pain, or simply help someone get a good night's sleep. It was a double-edged sword, to be sure. Then there's the wild lettuce, Lactuca virosa, a relative of our modern lettuce, but with a distinctly more potent kick. It contains lactucarium, a milky substance that has mild sedative and analgesic properties. Peasants would sometimes smoke the dried leaves or prepare a tea from them to relax and ease their minds. Now, it's important to remember that this wasn't necessarily about seeking out wild highs. It was often about using what was available to cope with the realities of everyday life. It was about finding ways to alleviate pain, to ease anxiety, to find a moment of peace in a world that offered very little of it. And let's not forget the context. These weren't isolated incidents. These practices were often deeply embedded in the fabric of peasant society. They were part of their traditions, their rituals, their way of life. The local wise woman, or hedge witch, often held the knowledge of which plants could be used for what purpose, and she would guide her community in their use. These weren't clinical trials. There were overdoses, adverse reactions, and perhaps long-term negative health consequences that simply were chalked up to poor constitution. So the next time you picture a medieval peasant, don't just imagine someone toiling away in the fields. Imagine someone who knew the secrets of the plants around them, someone who had their own ways of finding solace and escape in a difficult world, someone who understood that even in the darkest of times, there was always a little bit of magic to be found in the natural world, and who knew that sometimes, just sometimes, a little bit of magic was exactly what they needed. Okay, so we've explored some of the ways medieval folks might have, well, altered their state of mind. We've talked about the herbs, the brews, the traditions, but it's important to remember, this wasn't always a straightforward, pleasant experience. In fact, it could be downright dangerous. You see, one of the biggest problems wasn't necessarily using psychoactive substances, but the, shall we say, creative ways they were often prepared, and crucially, the potential for adulteration. Imagine you're a medieval peasant. You've had a long, hard day working the fields. You're tired, your back aches, and all you want is a little something to take the edge off. Maybe a bit of ale, perhaps with some herbs added to it, for extra effect. But finding quality ingredients wasn't always easy. And sometimes, desperate times led to desperate measures. Adulteration, the practice of adding cheaper, sometimes toxic, ingredients to food and drink to increase profit margins, or simply to stretch meager supplies, was rampant in medieval society. It wasn't just limited to psychoactive substances, of course. Bakers might add chalk to bread to make it appear whiter and heavier. Butchers might use questionable ingredients to plump up their sausages. But when it came to things intended to alter your perception, the consequences could be, well, let's just say unforeseen. Think about it. You're buying henbane, let's say, for a pain remedy, or perhaps something a little stronger. You go to your local herb seller, but how do you really know what you're getting? Maybe they've mixed in some other similar-looking plant to bulk it out. And that plant could be, well, it could be anything. Maybe it's less potent, leaving you disappointed and still in pain. Or maybe, and this is the scary part, it's more toxic. Maybe it's something that reacts badly with the henbane itself. We're talking about a time before strict regulations, before chemical analysis, before anyone really understood the complex interactions between different plant compounds. It was largely trial and error, passed down through generations, often with a healthy dose of superstition mixed in. So a well-intentioned remedy could easily turn into a toxic concoction. And it wasn't just about accidental adulteration. Sometimes, it was deliberate. Imagine someone trying to pass off a cheap, weak ale as a stronger, more potent brew. They might add things like, well, frankly, we don't always know exactly what they added. Historical records are often vague, referring to unwholesome ingredients or harmful additives. but we can make educated guesses. Things like darnel, a common weed that can contaminate grain, could cause dizziness, nausea, and even convulsions. Certain fungi could produce toxins that mimicked the effects of ergot poisoning, and sometimes people would simply add poisonous plants intentionally, either out of malice or out of a misguided belief that it would enhance the effects of the drink. Even the preparation methods themselves could be dangerous. Many psychoactive plants require careful processing to remove or neutralize toxins. If you didn't know what you were doing, or if you were in a hurry, you could easily end up with a preparation that was far more potent and far more dangerous than intended. Take mandrake, for example. It's a powerful hallucinogen, but it also contains toxic compounds. Preparing it safely required a deep understanding of its properties and careful attention to detail. If you just dug it up, chopped it up, and threw it into a brew, you could be in for a very, very bad time, and that's putting it mildly. The consequences of these toxic preparations could range from unpleasant side effects like vomiting and diarrhea to more serious issues like delirium, seizures, organ damage, and even death. Imagine taking something to relieve pain, only to find yourself writhing in agony from a completely different ailment, and think about the cumulative effect. If you were regularly consuming adulterated ales or herbal remedies, you could be slowly poisoning yourself over time. These chronic exposures could lead to a range of health problems that were difficult to diagnose and even harder to treat. Remember, medieval medicine wasn't exactly advanced. Doctors often relied on observation and traditional remedies, which might have been ineffective or even counterproductive in treating the effects of poisoning. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine medieval people enjoying simple pleasures and natural remedies. But the reality was far more complex and often far more dangerous. The lack of regulation, the limited knowledge of toxicology, and the prevalence of adulteration created a very real risk for anyone seeking to alter their state of mind, whether for pleasure, pain relief, or religious experience. So the next time you read about medieval herbs and brews, remember that it wasn't all magical potions and mystical visions. Sometimes it was just a gamble with potentially deadly consequences. And that, my friends, is a sobering thought indeed. Okay, let's delve into the medieval approach to, shall we say, overindulgence. What did they do when someone had a bit too much mead, or perhaps misjudged the potency of their henbane concoction? Well, medieval medicine, bless its heart, had its own unique ways of dealing with intoxication and potential overdoses. Remember, folks, these methods were born from the knowledge, or sometimes the lack thereof, of the time. We're not endorsing any of these practices. Please, please, please don't try these at home. This is purely for educational and hopefully slightly entertaining purposes. So let's start with the basics. Good old alcohol poisoning. Ale, mead, wine. These were staples, remember, and sometimes people, especially during feasts or celebrations, drank a lot. The primary goal, naturally, was to sober someone up, and quickly. One common approach, and you might find this familiar, was, well, forcing the person to vomit. Yes, inducing vomiting was a go-to method for all sorts of ailments, and intoxication was no exception. They believed it purged the body of the offending substance, the evil humors, if you will, causing the inebriation. Now, how did they induce vomiting? That's where things get interesting. Sometimes it was as simple as sticking a finger down the throat. Other times they'd use emetic herbs, specifically those believed to promote purging. Ipecacuanha root, though more common in later periods, had similar medieval counterparts, various local plants that would irritate the stomach and hopefully bring about the desired result. And of course, there was always the direct approach. I'm referring to copious amounts of water, or more often, something sour. Vinegar, particularly, was thought to counteract the effects of alcohol. Think of it as a medieval electrolyte drink, only much, much harsher. The idea was that the acidity would somehow neutralize the alcohol. Whether it actually worked, or just added to the overall misery, is debatable. Now let's move beyond simple overindulgence to something more concerning: plant-based intoxications like henbane or mandrake overdoses. These were far more serious, and the remedies reflect the fear and uncertainty surrounding these substances. When dealing with potential poisoning from psychoactive plants, diagnosis was key, and understandably, rather primitive. Symptoms like dilated pupils, delirium, hallucinations, rapid pulse, or even paralysis were all red flags. But distinguishing between different types of poisoning, given the limited knowledge of pharmacology, was incredibly difficult. The treatment, therefore, tended to be general. Again, inducing vomiting was a first line of defense, but often the patient was already unconscious or delirious, making that difficult and dangerous. Beyond that, the focus shifted to attempting to counteract the specific symptoms. For example, if someone was experiencing severe hallucinations, they might be restrained to prevent them from harming themselves or others. Cold water might be splashed on their face to shock them back to a semblance of reality. And prayers, lots and lots of prayers. Remember, in medieval times, the line between medicine and religion was often blurred. Illness was often seen as a punishment from God or the work of malevolent forces, so religious intervention was considered essential. They also used a variety of antidotes, though their effectiveness is, shall we say, questionable. Milk, for instance, was believed to soothe the stomach and bind the poison, preventing it from being absorbed. Other common remedies included charcoal, which surprisingly does have some merit in absorbing toxins, and various herbal concoctions aimed at purifying the blood. One fascinating, if rather unsettling, practice was the use of the riak. The riak was a complex medicinal compound, essentially a universal antidote, containing dozens of ingredients, including, and this is where it gets interesting, small amounts of opium. The idea was that the small dose of opium would counteract the effects of other poisons, though, again, its actual effectiveness is debatable. It was incredibly expensive and usually only accessible to the wealthy. Another approach involved the concept of similia similibus curantur, like cures like. This meant that, in some cases, they would administer a small dose of the same substance that caused the poisoning, believing it would somehow neutralize the larger dose. This was an extremely risky practice, obviously, and likely did more harm than good in many cases. Imagine trying to cure a henbane overdose with a tiny bit more henbane. Bloodletting was also a common practice, believed to remove the tainted blood and cleanse the body. Now, we know that bloodletting is generally not a good idea, especially in cases of poisoning, as it can weaken the patient further. But in medieval times, it was a standard procedure for a wide range of ailments. One of the most crucial aspects of treatment was simply supportive care, keeping the patient warm, hydrated, and as comfortable as possible while waiting for the effects of the poison to wear off. This often involved placing the patient in a quiet, darkened room, away from stimulating influences. It's also important to remember that medieval medicine relied heavily on observation and experience. If a particular remedy seemed to work in one case, it would be repeated in others. Unfortunately, without proper scientific controls, it was difficult to determine whether a remedy was truly effective, or whether the patient simply recovered on their own. And sadly, many people didn't recover. Overdoses, especially from potent substances like henbane or mandrake, could be fatal. The lack of effective treatments, combined with the limited understanding of toxicology, meant that mortality rates were likely high. But let's not paint too bleak a picture. Medieval healers were doing the best they could with the knowledge and resources available to them. They were observant, resourceful, and deeply committed to helping their patients. While their methods might seem crude or even dangerous by modern standards, they represent an important chapter in the history of medicine, a time when humans were grappling with the mysteries of the natural world and trying to find ways to alleviate suffering, even if those ways were, well, a bit experimental. And remember, even if they didn't always succeed, they were trying, they were learning, and they were laying the groundwork for the more effective treatments that would eventually emerge. So let's appreciate their efforts, learn from their mistakes, and be grateful for the advancements in medicine that we enjoy today. Because trust me, you'd much rather have a modern doctor treat your overindulgence than rely on medieval remedies. Sweet dreams. Alright, settle in, because now we're going to take a little journey. We're packing our bags, not literally, of course, and we're going to visit different corners of medieval Europe to see how their relationship with psychoactive substances differed. Because it wasn't a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. Geography, culture, even just the local climate played a huge role in what folks were imbibing, ingesting, or, well, let's just say experiencing. Think of it like this. What grows in sunny Italy isn't going to be the same as what thrives in the colder lands of Scandinavia. And that, my friends, has a profound effect on what ends up in your cup, your cauldron, or your medieval medicine cabinet. Let's start our grand tour in the sunny lands of the Mediterranean. Southern Europe, with its warm climate, was prime territory for grape cultivation. So naturally, wine was king. Wine wasn't just a drink, it was practically a dietary staple. It was safer than water, generally, and it was available in a wider variety of strengths than, say, what you'd find further north. Beyond just basic table wine, they had sweet wines, spiced wines, and all sorts of herbal infusions. This was where the art of winemaking really started to blossom, with different regions developing their own distinct styles. And because wine was so intertwined with religious practices, monasteries became hubs of knowledge and innovation in viticulture, carefully cultivating vineyards and refining their winemaking techniques. So yes, those monks were onto something. Now, hop on over to Central Europe. Here the picture gets a little more herby. The use of Groot, a blend of herbs used to flavor and preserve beer before hops became widespread, was particularly prevalent in places like Germany and the Low Countries. And these Groot blends, they could be quite potent. Ingredients like bog myrtle, yarrow, and even small amounts of psychoactive plants like henbane or belladonna might find their way into the brew. This wasn't necessarily about getting hammered as much as it was about adding flavor, but the side effects could certainly have been interesting. You might be just trying to relax after a long day in the fields and suddenly find yourself having a conversation with a talking badger. Okay, maybe not, but you get the idea. Let's travel a bit further north, shall we? Scandinavia. The land of Vikings and long nights. Here the climate wasn't as conducive to grape growing, so mead became a popular choice. Mead, you see, is basically honey wine, but it was more than just fermented honey. Vikings, being Vikings, weren't afraid to experiment. They added all sorts of things to their mead, berries, spices, and you guessed it, psychoactive herbs. One particular plant, the fly agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria, is sometimes associated with Viking berserkers. Now, there's some debate about whether they actually used it to induce their battle frenzy, but the possibility is certainly intriguing. Imagine going into battle with a side of mushrooms. Gives a whole new meaning to tripping over the enemy, doesn't it? And now, let's sail across the English Channel to the British Isles. Here we see a blend of influences. Ale was a common drink, often brewed with Groot or local herbs, but the British Isles also had a strong tradition of herbalism and folklore, which meant that people were quite familiar with the properties of different plants. Henbane, mandrake, and other psychoactive species were known and used, albeit sometimes cautiously, for medicinal or ritual purposes. Plus, the damp climate was quite suitable for the growth of opium poppies, although their usage in Britain was limited. The use of herbs, particularly in rural communities, was often passed down through generations, becoming deeply ingrained in local customs and traditions. Now let's venture eastward into Eastern Europe. Here the story becomes even more nuanced. The vastness of the region meant that local practices and plant availability varied significantly. In some areas, mead remained popular, while in others different types of beer or fermented grain beverages were more common. The use of psychoactive plants was often tied to traditional folk medicine and shamanistic practices, particularly in more remote regions. Remember that while the church tried to exert its influence, older pagan traditions and customs often lingered, particularly in rural areas, meaning rituals and practices were often kept quiet. One interesting example is the use of hemp, not just for fiber but also potentially for its psychoactive properties. Evidence suggests that hemp was cultivated in Eastern Europe for centuries, and while it's hard to say definitively how frequently it was used for its mind-altering effects, it's certainly a possibility. So as you can see, there wasn't just one medieval Europe when it came to psychoactive substances. Different regions had different drinks, different herbs, and different cultural attitudes towards altering consciousness. What was considered acceptable in one place might have been frowned upon in another, and what grew abundantly in one area might have been completely unknown in another. These regional differences add a richness and complexity to our understanding of how medieval people interacted with the world around them, and how they sought to change their perception of it. It's a fascinating reminder that history isn't a monolithic narrative, but rather a collection of countless individual stories, each shaped by their own unique circumstances, and those circumstances in turn were often shaped by the plants that grew in their backyards, and the drinks they shared with their neighbors. Pretty cool, huh? Friends, settle in, and let's gently turn the page in our exploration of medieval altered states. We've spent a good while journeying through the familiar fields and forests of Europe, encountering the poppy, the henbane, and the ever-present ale. But the world, even in medieval times, wasn't static. The great wheels of exploration and trade were slowly starting to turn, setting in motion a transformation that would eventually reshape the very substances people used, and in turn their perceptions of reality. We're entering a period of transition. Now, it's crucial to understand this wasn't a sudden overnight change. It wasn't as if one day the medieval world woke up and everyone was smoking tobacco. No, my friends, history rarely works that way. It was a slow, almost imperceptible drift, a gradual introduction of new plants and spices from what they called the New World. Think of it as whispers on the wind, exotic scents carried across vast oceans, tales told by sailors returning from distant lands. The Americas, of course, held a treasure trove of substances entirely unknown to the medieval European palate and mind. But getting those substances into the medieval world was a logistical puzzle, a dance of trade routes, cultural exchange, and gradual acceptance. We have to remember that for much of our period, direct contact between Europe and the Americas simply didn't exist. The Vikings had a brief dalliance with North America centuries before, but those encounters left little lasting impact in terms of substance use. It was the later voyages of exploration, starting around the late 15th century, that truly began to open up this new chapter. Initially, the impact was subtle. Spices, those precious commodities that had always held a place of honor on medieval tables, were among the first to arrive in greater quantities and variety. While not all spices are psychoactive in themselves, their presence influenced the overall culinary landscape. Think about it. A society already accustomed to using herbs and spices for medicinal purposes, for flavoring their food, and even for masking the taste of questionable ingredients, was now presented with a whole new array of aromatic possibilities. This fostered a culture of experimentation and a growing openness to foreign and exotic substances. Imagine the scene. A wealthy merchant, recently returned from a voyage to the East, displays his wares. Among the silks and jewels, he carefully unpacks a small quantity of something new, perhaps chilies, not instantly popular. Imagine the first person to bite into a chili pepper, expecting the familiar taste of black pepper. A surprise to say the least. But slowly these new flavors began to be incorporated into recipes, initially in the kitchens of the wealthy, and eventually trickling down to the lower classes. Now, while direct access to the Americas was limited during much of the medieval period, which, let's remember, we're generally considering to end around the late 15th century, some plants and spices did make their way indirectly through established trade routes. Think of the Silk Road, that ancient network connecting East and West. While it primarily facilitated the movement of goods between Asia and Europe, it also served as a conduit for the exchange of knowledge, and yes, even plants. For example, evidence suggests that certain varieties of pepper originating in the Americas might have reached Europe before direct contact was established. These early encounters, however, were likely limited and their impact relatively minor. The real shift occurred during the Renaissance and the early modern period as exploration and colonization intensified. Tobacco, perhaps the most iconic of the New World substances, is a prime example. While its use by indigenous populations in the Americas dates back centuries, it didn't truly take hold in Europe until the 16th century and beyond. And initially, it wasn't necessarily viewed as a recreational drug. It was often promoted for its medicinal properties. Think of it. Tobacco was initially seen as a cure-all, a remedy for everything from headaches to toothaches. It was smoked, chewed, snuffed, and even applied topically. It was only gradually that its recreational use became more widespread. And with that widespread use came new rituals, new social practices, and new ways of altering consciousness. Similarly, chocolate, derived from the cacao bean, another gift from the Americas, began its slow ascent to popularity. In its original form, consumed by the Aztecs and Mayans, it was often a bitter, spicy drink, quite different from the sweet confection we know today. The Spanish conquistadors, upon encountering it, initially found it unappealing, but they soon began to adapt it to their own tastes, adding sugar and other spices. It's important to remember that the introduction of these new substances wasn't always met with universal enthusiasm. There were often concerns about their safety, their morality, and their potential impact on society. Some religious leaders condemned tobacco use, viewing it as a sinful and decadent habit. Medical practitioners debated its efficacy and potential side effects, and some rulers even attempted to ban its use altogether. But ultimately, the allure of these new substances proved too strong to resist. And beyond just tobacco and chocolate, other plants and spices from the Americas began to trickle into the European consciousness. Potatoes, tomatoes, and maize, while not psychoactive themselves, revolutionized agriculture and nutrition, indirectly impacting society in profound ways. And other, more subtle influences were also at play. New dyes, derived from American plants, transformed the textile industry. New medicinal herbs, brought back by explorers and botanists, found their way into apothecaries and home remedies. So as we gently conclude this section, let's remember that the medieval world, while often perceived as isolated and unchanging, was in fact constantly evolving. The gradual introduction of New World plants and spices, while perhaps not immediately transformative, set the stage for a profound shift in European society and culture. It opened up new avenues for trade, new possibilities for culinary experimentation, and of course, new ways to alter consciousness. It was the beginning of a long and complex relationship, a relationship that continues to shape our world to this day. Now, rest your head and let these images of spices and new lands dance behind your eyelids. Okay, let's settle in now, friends. We've explored some fascinating, and sometimes a little unsettling, aspects of how psychoactive plants were used in medieval times. But now, let's turn our attention to something a little lighter, a little more whimsical. We're going to look at how these plants, these experiences, wove their way into the very fabric of medieval storytelling. It's a world of legends and lore, where the line between reality and altered perception often blurred. Think about it. In a world where literacy wasn't widespread, where entertainment was often oral, passed down through generations, stories were incredibly powerful. They were a way to explain the unexplainable, to teach lessons, and let's be honest, to scare the living daylights out of each other around a crackling fire. And what better way to add a touch of magic, a touch of the otherworldly, than to incorporate the effects of psychoactive substances? Let's start with the obvious suspect, witchcraft. We've touched upon henbane and belladonna and their association with flying ointments, those infamous brews that supposedly allowed witches to soar through the night sky. Now, whether these ointments actually allowed flight is highly debatable. What's more likely is that the hallucinogenic effects created the illusion of flight, a powerfully vivid dream state experienced while slathered in these potent concoctions, and that's where the legends bloomed. Can you imagine the stories that sprung from such experiences? Tales of shadowy figures dancing under the moonlight, communing with spirits, and wielding powers beyond mortal comprehension. These narratives weren't just entertainment, they reinforced societal beliefs, both about the dangers of witchcraft and the perceived power of those who practiced it. Then we have the more subtle influences. Consider the tales of enchanted forests, places where travelers lose their way, encounter strange creatures, and undergo transformative experiences. It's easy to imagine these forests populated not just with mythical beasts, but also with plants capable of altering perception. A seemingly innocent berry, a fragrant flower, a puff of mysterious smoke, any of these could lead to a journey into the subconscious, blurring the lines between reality and fantasy. Perhaps a weary traveler, stumbling through the woods after a long day, unknowingly ingests a psychoactive plant. What follows could be interpreted as a divine vision, a curse, or an encounter with a fairy realm, depending on the cultural context, and of course the specific effects of the substance. Mandrake, with its human-like root, held a particularly prominent place in medieval folklore. Remember that piercing scream it was said to emit when pulled from the ground. That alone is the stuff of nightmares. But the mandrake was also associated with fertility, protection, and even treasure. The belief that it could only be safely uprooted by a dog, who would then die in its master's place, adds another layer of intrigue. It's quite possible that the mandrake's actual hallucinogenic properties contributed to these fantastical beliefs. Maybe someone, under the influence, thought they saw the root scream, or experienced vivid visions while handling it. These experiences, embellished over time, could easily have solidified its place in folklore. And what about the quest for the Holy Grail? While primarily a religious artifact, the Grail is often depicted as a source of divine inspiration and transformative power. Could its attainment be interpreted, on a metaphorical level, as the achievement of an altered state of consciousness? A union with the divine achieved through spiritual practices, perhaps aided by natural substances. It's a thought to ponder, isn't it? The stories surrounding the Grail are so layered and complex, it's hard to dismiss the possibility that altered states, whether induced by meditation, fasting, or yes, even certain plants, played a role in shaping the narrative. Now, let's not forget the role of alcohol. Ale, mead, and wine were staples of medieval life, and while not always overtly psychoactive in the way we might think of drugs today, they certainly played a role in altering mood and behavior. Festive celebrations, religious ceremonies, even everyday meals often involved the consumption of alcohol. This constant exposure to altered states would have undoubtedly influenced social interactions, artistic expression, and yes, even storytelling. Think of the drunken revelry in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. The heightened emotions, the outrageous behaviors, the blurring of social boundaries, all likely fueled by copious amounts of ale. These moments of intoxication became integral parts of the medieval experience and naturally found their way into the stories that were told and retold. The fascinating thing is, the medieval people weren't necessarily trying to hide the use of these plants. They were simply incorporating them into their existing worldview, weaving them into their narratives in ways that made sense within their cultural context. They understood that certain plants could induce visions, relieve pain, or alter behavior. They might not have fully understood the scientific mechanisms behind these effects, but they certainly experienced them firsthand. And those experiences became the seeds from which legends and lore would sprout, enriching their world with magic, mystery, and a touch of the truly bizarre. So the next time you read a medieval tale of enchanted forests, powerful witches, or divine quests, remember to consider the potential role of psychoactive plants. They may not be explicitly mentioned, but their influence can be felt in the very fabric of the story, a subtle but powerful reminder of the close relationship between medieval people and the plants that altered their perception of reality. It's a fascinating window into a world where the boundaries between the physical and the spiritual were often blurred, and where the power of storytelling was used to make sense of the mysteries that surrounded them. Okay, let's settle in and untangle some of the, shall we say, creative interpretations that have sprung up around the topic of medieval drug use. Because honestly, a lot of what you see out there paints a picture that's either wildly sensationalized or just plain wrong. It's time to gently push back against the misinformation and really appreciate the complexities of what was actually going on. First, the big one, the idea that everyone in the Middle Ages was constantly tripping their faces off. You see it in fantasy novels, you hear it in hushed whispers about secret societies, the image of a perpetually stoned medieval populace. Now, while altered states were certainly a part of their lives, they weren't living in some kind of permanent psychedelic haze. Substance use was often tied to specific rituals, medical needs, or social occasions. It wasn't the everyday experience for most people, most of the time. Think less Game of Thrones rave, and more carefully considered herbal remedy.
Another misconception is that all drug use in the Middle Ages was some kind of rebellious act, a challenge to authority, or purely for hedonistic pleasure. While sure, there were probably individuals who indulged for kicks, a lot of it was interwoven with established traditions and even endorsed by medical practitioners or religious figures. The church, while wary of excess, understood the medicinal and even spiritual potential of certain substances. And remember, many of the plants we're talking about were also used for completely mundane purposes, like flavoring food or dyeing cloth. So reducing it all to a simple story of rebellion or pleasure-seeking misses the mark entirely. Then there's the idea that the Middle Ages were somehow uniquely depraved or drug-addled compared to other historical periods. Look, every society throughout history has found ways to alter its consciousness, from ancient civilizations using psychoactive mushrooms to modern societies, well, you know. The types of substances and the ways they were used might have differed, but the basic human desire to explore altered states is a constant. Don't fall into the trap of thinking the Middle Ages were particularly unique in this regard. They weren't, they just had access to different ingredients and different knowledge about them. We also need to be very careful about projecting our modern understanding of drugs onto the medieval world. The concepts of addiction, recreational use as distinct from medicinal use, and even the very definition of what constitutes a drug were different back then. They didn't have the same scientific understanding of pharmacology that we do today. They relied on empirical observation, traditional knowledge passed down through generations, and a worldview often steeped in magic and superstition. So when we try to apply our modern frameworks to their practices, we're inevitably going to miss a lot of the nuance. And speaking of magic, there's the ever-present connection between psychoactive plants and witchcraft. This is a tricky area because it's so easily sensationalized. Yes, certain plants like henbane and belladonna were associated with witchcraft and were believed to be ingredients in flying ointments and other concoctions. But it's important to remember that the connection between these plants and witchcraft was complex and varied. Not everyone who used these plants was a witch, and not all witches necessarily used them. The association was often based on folklore, rumor, and the anxieties of a society that feared the unknown. And let's not forget that many of the accusations of witchcraft were based on flimsy evidence or outright paranoia. So while there's definitely a link, we need to approach it with sensitivity and a healthy dose of skepticism. Finally, let's be wary of romanticizing or glorifying medieval drug use. While it's fascinating to learn about these practices, we shouldn't forget that many of these substances were also dangerous. Overdoses were a real risk, adulteration was common, and the long-term effects of some of these plants were poorly understood.
There's a tendency to see these substances as some kind of mystical key to unlocking hidden knowledge or experiencing spiritual enlightenment. And while that might have been the case for some individuals, it's important to remember that for others, it could have been a path to suffering and even death. So as we delve deeper into the world of medieval psychoactive substances, let's keep these misconceptions in mind. Let's approach the topic with curiosity, respect, and a critical eye. Let's try to understand these practices within their historical context, without projecting our modern biases onto them. And let's remember that the story of medieval drug use is a complex and multifaceted one, far more nuanced and fascinating than the simplistic narratives we often encounter. It's a story of healing, of ritual, of social connection, and sometimes of danger and exploitation. It's a story that deserves to be told with accuracy and sensitivity. And hopefully, by dispelling some of these myths, we can begin to appreciate the true depth and complexity of this often misunderstood aspect of medieval life. Now, let's continue, shall we? There's still so much more to uncover. So we've journeyed through the fields, forests, and even the kitchens of medieval Europe, uncovering a world where altered states of consciousness were far more commonplace and nuanced than we might have initially imagined. It's tempting to paint a picture of rampant intoxication, of everyone stumbling around in a perpetual haze, but that would be a gross oversimplification. The reality, as always, is far more complex. What we've seen is a society where psychoactive substances were deeply intertwined with everyday life. Alcohol, in its various forms, ale, mead, wine, wasn't just a recreational beverage, it was a crucial source of hydration, nutrition, and even social cohesion. It brought people together, fueled celebrations, and eased the burdens of backbreaking labor. And the herbs and plants that infused these brews, or were used in other preparations, weren't just random additions. They were carefully selected, often steeped in tradition and lore, and used for specific purposes, be it to enhance flavor, to provide a medicinal benefit, or yes, to induce a desired altered state. Think about the opium poppy, cultivated for its pain-relieving properties, its seeds sprinkled on bread, its resin carefully harvested and used to ease suffering, or the often misunderstood henbane, a plant fraught with danger, but also possessing powerful medicinal qualities when used with knowledge and caution. And let's not forget the legendary mandrake, a root shrouded in myth and folklore, believed to hold magical properties and capable of both healing and harming. These weren't recreational drugs in the modern sense, although undoubtedly some were used purely for pleasure. They were tools, integrated into the fabric of medieval life, employed for a variety of purposes, from easing pain and treating illness to facilitating religious experiences and bolstering social bonds. They were part of a holistic worldview, where the natural world was seen as a source of both healing and danger, and where the line between the physical and the spiritual was often blurred. The medieval perspective on altered states differed drastically from our own. While intoxication certainly had its downsides and was often frowned upon in excess, altered states themselves weren't inherently seen as negative. Visions, dreams, and trance-like states were often viewed as pathways to spiritual insight, as glimpses into another realm. This is evident in the mystical experiences of religious figures, the folklore surrounding witchcraft, and even in the rituals and celebrations of everyday life. It's important to remember the context. Life in medieval times was often harsh, unpredictable, and fraught with hardship. Pain, disease, and death were constant companions. In this environment, psychoactive substances offered a means of escape, of solace, of connection, both to oneself and to something larger than oneself. They were a way to cope with the realities of life, to find meaning in suffering, and to connect with the divine. However, this relationship wasn't without its dangers. The line between medicinal use and abuse was often thin, and the lack of standardized dosages and regulations meant that accidental overdoses and toxic reactions were common. Adulteration was also a significant problem, with unscrupulous merchants adding harmful substances to their products to increase their potency or profit. And of course, the potential for addiction was always present. Moreover, the church played a complex role, attempting to regulate and control the use of psychoactive substances, particularly those associated with pagan rituals or witchcraft. While some within the church recognized the potential for spiritual insight through altered states, others viewed them with suspicion and fear, seeing them as a threat to religious authority. So what can we take away from all of this? Perhaps the most important thing is to appreciate the complexity and nuance of the relationship between medieval people and psychoactive substances. It wasn't a simple case of drug use being good or bad, right or wrong. It was a multifaceted interaction shaped by cultural beliefs, social practices, religious attitudes, and the harsh realities of medieval life. By examining this relationship, we gain a deeper understanding of the medieval worldview, their beliefs about the natural world, their attitudes towards pain, suffering, and death, and their search for meaning and connection. We also gain a greater appreciation for the historical context in which these substances were used and the profound differences between their understanding and our own. Ultimately, exploring the history of psychoactive substances in medieval times isn't just about drugs, it's about people. It's about their lives, their experiences, their beliefs, and their struggles. And by understanding their relationship with these substances, we can gain a richer and more nuanced understanding of the medieval world as a whole. Perhaps as we drift off to sleep, we can consider the echoes of those medieval experiences and appreciate the long and winding road that has led us to our current understanding.